Right. Well, why don't we get this show on the road? Let me drop our little links and stuff into the chat, and then I'll start our spiel. So there's the usual links, and I'll get this show on the road. What time is it? It's Gnothi Seautin time, because for Homo sapiens, it's always Gnothi Seautin time. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Kenneth Smith seminar, where Kafka reminds us we are permitted to attain the Archimedean standpoint only on the condition that we wield it against ourselves. Dope. This is your moderator, Rick Marshall, with the 175th, oh my God, weekly installment of our long running seminar about Smith's existentialist philosophy book, Millennia and Microcosm, in which he explores how we might escape the trap of our own point of view, like Daedalus escaping the labyrinth he foolishly built and was then himself trapped in by the law of unintended consequences that haunts all mortal lives. When you think of Daedalus, when you think of Homo sapiens, think also Wile E. Coyote, for that is how the ancient Greeks saw us, hoist on our own petards. In this book, Smith dives with us into the alien worldviews of the ancient and medieval epochs. Why? So we can learn to see the world through their eyes. Why? Because just as we can see truths about the world they couldn't, hello, E equals MC squared, they saw truths that we can't. Hello, Sophra Sune, which moderns don't even have a word for. And with the medieval section of this book, which we are in now, hello, Kingdom of the Spirit. At the end of the book, Smith will bring us back to the modern epoch so we can, for the first time, see it not as the obvious truth we all assumed it was, but as the peculiar, limited, partly helpful, but partly harmful perspective it actually is. When we can voluntarily shift between those three worldviews, according to Kenneth Smith, we create for the first time in our lives the possibility of meaningful freedom, the freedom to question what we take for granted, and the freedom to learn to appreciate the fresh insights offered by countless other alien worldviews. When last we left our intrepid heroes, we had just finished chapter 8 and begun chapter 9. So today we're going to continue with chapter 9. The link to the text of chapter 9 I have posted in the chat, so you can click on that and follow along. We are resuming with paragraph 3 in there today, and I'll post the text and read it as we go so we can talk about it. It's juicy stuff. So this is a particularly challenging chapter. It explores how the medieval church shifted focus away from the teachings of Jesus to the indoctrination needed to construct a religious empire. And in chapter 8, the focus was on how the introduction of heaven and hell as the ultimate carrot and stick gets in the way of Jesus's message of talking about how to be a good human being. It creates a perverse incentive. And Kenneth explored that in chapter 8. We finished that up last week. This week, we're exploring faith and the different forms that faith can take, and how the popular forms of faith have a tendency to corrupt spirituality. And there is a deeper form of faith that Jesus was trying to teach, and some people can hear it and some people can't. And Kenneth Smith is going to explore how our modern worldview does not prepare us to properly understand what Jesus was talking about. So we want to remember that in the 2 weeks prior, we walked through the Gospel of Thomas and the Q sayings, and what we sort of discovered is that all these other early sayings gospels were excluded from the Christian canon. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, when they began canonizing, they focused, instead of focusing on the message of Jesus, they began focusing on proving a supposedly unbroken chain of apostolic succession to establish the absolute authority of the bishops in the 4th century to command their flock, and on a theology constructed around an afterlife of eternal reward for the faithful or punishment for the disobedient. So where we are right now, and I will be doing, for those of you who haven't been here before, we are doing Q&A all the way through this. I've got to get through the opening spiel, and then we'll start into it. So whoever just had your hand up, you can put it back up again. I won't forget. I'll call on you in a couple of minutes. So we are currently in the middle of a 3-year arc about medieval civilization and its worldview. For the past 2 months, we've been augmenting Kenneth Smith's text, Millennia and Microcosm, with primary source materials of the early Christians to let various medieval and proto-medieval thinkers speak for themselves. We started with the early Christian sayings tradition, first with Thomas, then the Q source. And today, having transitioned from chapter 8 to chapter 9, we're now resuming our exploration of early Christian writers with Paul, who we're going to spend a good number of weeks on, because Paul is some very juicy early Christianity. Yeah, there's a lot to explore, especially if we take Paul out from where he's been hidden behind the Gospels and put him first where he belongs chronologically. If we can read Paul without assuming that Paul agreed with everything that's in the Gospels, we discover that Paul has a very interesting view of what Christianity is. It's quite different from Mark and Matthew and Luke and John. So we're going to explore that together. Um, this seminar, for those just joining us, is organized by the thoughtful but reserved David Rowell, who rarely comments but is always present. And he knows Kenneth Smith's writing as well as anybody. And also on the call, along with us, we have regulars who are here every week. We also have Donald, who actually studied under Kenneth Smith back when Kenneth Smith was a philosophy professor, before he decided to become a full-time philosopher instead. And the caveats for those, following on live stream or watching the YouTube recordings, the seminar is not a show. It's not a debate. It's not an exercise in rigorous logic. It's not an attempt to transmit any kind of dogmatic philosophical system. It is an existentialist philosophical book club. Kenneth Smith is a full-time philosopher, started out as a philosophy professor. He writes in a dense, allusive style that frequently refers to other writers and artists to bring them and their writings into the conversation. So what we do in the seminar is we slow down and chew the text. We find his references and we talk about them. Why would he talk about Kafka here? Is this a reference to Hegel? Is this a Kierkegaard reference? We're gonna When we get to the Kenneth Smith portion of this discussion, after we finish up with Paul in the start, we're gonna find Kierkegaard references right out of the gate. Only he doesn't name him. You just have to know how Kenneth Smith's keyword system of writing works, and we're gonna unlock that together. So together we explore all these tangents and all these allusions as well as the main text. And of course, we all add our own experiences and perspectives into the mix. Everybody who's a regular on this call has been a major contributor to what the discussion is, what the exploration is. Even people who have been present but are not present here today, those of us who are regulars will from time to time bring their perspectives back. We'll talk about equivocation at the gates of the city. We'll talk about other things that are relevant. We're not trying to race through. We're not trying to enforce a certain interpretation. We're just trying to unpack the text and explore philosophy together. Since Kenneth Smith was a philosophy professor, this is entirely in keeping with his approach. He wants us to really to philosophize, not to memorize and catechize. So this is a rich, patient conversation. It is not about scoring points. It's not about winning. Nobody wins here. It's about engaging in philosophy together, which means we all get to win. So that's our intro. It's out of the way. Any questions or comments before we proceed? When we'll proceed, we'll dive into Paul. So anybody? Any regulars have anything they want to add to the newbies? We've got some newbies this week. Anything you think they ought to know? All right. Well, hearing none, let's dive into the material. This exploration of Paul, there's a lot of sources you can go to for analyzing Paul. This one is continuing a theme we've been on for a while. We're using Burton Mack's book, Who Wrote the New Testament? I just put the title and the author in the text. We started with that. And because it was the second Burton Mack book we've been using in the seminar. The first one was The Lost Gospel, about the Q source that biblical scholars have discovered within the text of Matthew and Luke and recreated, and it represents an early sayings tradition. And Burton Mack's discussion of that was so interesting and helpful. We decided to continue with Who Wrote the New Testament, in which he broadens the discussion to more than just the original Q community, which is one of many original early Christian communities, but who are all the other early Christian communities running around in the 40s and 50s before the Gospels are written. And they include, like Stephen did a presentation a few weeks ago in another location about about the apocalyptic Jesus. And there is a group of early Christians who absolutely see Jesus as an apocalyptic figure. The Q group saw Jesus as a wisdom teacher. They didn't remember anything about his life or his death. All they talked about is the things he told them to remember. We'll talk later about Mark and the community that Mark grows out of and why he, gets interested in the passion of Jesus and the relationship between Jesus and his disciples. I often shorthand it by referring to Mark's Jesus as cranky Jesus, because Mark has no patience for his apostles and often chews them out. What we're going to do now in between is Paul's Jesus. And Paul's Jesus is different from all of these. And there's others besides. It is the most interesting feature of early Christianity that despite the fact that the official story is that there's this simple, unbroken chain of apostolic succession, it begins with one unified voice and gradually heresies split off and have to be refuted. That's the official story. But when we look at the evidence available to us in the text and in archaeology, we find the opposite. It seems to start with a dozen separate Jesus movements, each of whom honors Jesus, but talks about Jesus with a completely different focus. And many of them don't seem to have heard of each other, although a few of them have. Paul's heard of a few of them, as he writes about in his letters. So we're starting with who wrote the New Testament as a way to get into Paul, even though there are other books that focus on Paul exclusively, because this book also talks about the other communities, the Q community, the pronouncements community, and so on. It's very interesting. Um, all right, so the first thing that Burton Mack wants us to look at is Corinthians, and specifically 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5. So here I'm gonna pop that in there. What Burton Mack is talking about in this section of the book about Paul is that Paul's interesting for his own sake, but in addition to that, as with Matthew and Luke, preserving an additional early stage of Christianity prior to Matthew and Luke, so too Paul preserves an earlier stage of Christianity prior to Paul. And part of the way we know that is he says so. There is a section in Corinthians where he cites what he was taught. He says, I was, he talks a lot in other letters about how he receives visions directly from Jesus now, and that he doesn't need the authority of anybody else to preach the gospel because Jesus just tells him what Jesus wants Paul to tell people. But in addition to that, in Corinthians, Jesus points out that that Paul points out that when he first became converted, he learned from an existing movement and they taught him something. And now his entire ministry, says Paul, is about passing along what he was taught. And he tells us what that is. So he's basically documenting a pre-Pauline stage of Christianity, which is interesting. As Burton Mack, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. As Burton Mack points out, in Romans, we'll talk about this later on this call, I think. Might be next week, but I think later on this call. Uh, Paul does it again. He shares another fragment, a pre-Pauline fragment, and it's different from the other pre-Pauline fragment. And so we're seeing two different stages of early Christian development that predate Paul as documented by Paul. And these are things most casual readers blow past. But biblical scholars note that, if you know what to look for and you study the grammar in the original Greek, you can see Paul literally is saying, and now I'm going to quote this poem, words to the effect of, here is this thing that I have been faithfully carrying along, and now I pass it on to you. He's got a little time machine buried inside of his letters. And so we're going to look at that today. Because of course, part of what we're trying to do is look into the darkness of the undocumented period, or let's say poorly documented period, very poorly before Paul. So the first part, and those of you who've done your Bible school, will not be surprised by anything I'm about to share, although the interpretation is a little unusual. Uh, the first part is about the kerygma. The kerygma is the proclamation of the gospel, and Paul is famous for. I think it was Sharon who pointed this out about a month ago. When we talk about Paul, we want to understand two important things, and one of them is the kerygma, and the other is how will the community of God be built. And those are Paul's two central concerns. How do we build a community? How do we keep going over time? How do we take care of each other and so on the one hand, and then on the other hand, what is this gospel that we're proclaiming? What's the core of it? And in this section in Corinthians, he boils it down to 7 lines. And the 7 lines have a poetic structure. And if you're reading a translation that doesn't preserve the line breaks and the poetry, you might think it's just some sentences. You don't even notice that this thing is a formal construction. And it's as though if you're citing the Emancipation Proclamation, and someone thinks you're just talking and these are just sentences, and they don't get that this is this constructed thing that you're preserving and passing along. But it's clear when you look at the grammar in the Greek. So this is what I'm going to share. Um, this is here it is here. And there's a lot of interesting parts to this. It's in two sections, and the first section is 3 lines, and the second section is 4 lines, and they're set up as parallels to each other. It's very poetic. So the first 3 lines are that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried. And that's the first part. And the second part, which parallels it and amplifies it, and you can see once you look at it that it is meant to be a parallel. It starts out, and that he was raised on the third day, according to the scriptures, which is an exact quote of the second line of the first stanza, and that he appeared. And then there's this fourth line in the second group that has been parenthetically added on to Cephas and then to the 12. And that breaks the pattern. But if we ignore that seventh line for a moment, what we see is that there is the death, there is the burial, there is the raising, and there is the appearance. 4 stages to the gospel, the kerygma. And this is the core of Paul's message of the kerygma. These 4 events. And they have been put to, and Paul didn't, the assessment of scholars is that Paul didn't write this. He's faithfully quoting what he's been taught. But it's very important to Paul. He sees a lot of meaning into it. And whoever put this together, as Burton Mack points out, this isn't something that was an off-the-cuff comment. Somebody constructed this thing because its poetic parallels and its use of language are very tricky. So the first thing is died for. I'm going to unpack this just like we would unpack Kenneth Smith. Died for is a translation of Greek term that is used specifically in martyr literature. Died for doesn't have any as a phrase, it doesn't have any meaning outside the martyr literature tradition. That's the tradition that coined the phrase died for. And it's all about saying, why did this martyrdom occur? Which is, I mean, if I die, no one has to ask what I died for. I died because I'm immortal. Mortals die. That's what they do, right? But to die for is a particular martyrology phrase. So as Burton Mack points out, in this first 3 lines, whoever composed this, the early Christians who composed this before Paul, they are specifically quoting the literature of martyrdom. That in the gospel, and you can read throughout the Tanakh all kinds of books, and outside the Tanakh in the additional Jewish apocrypha, if you will, you can read all kinds of works of martyrdom and compare them to what's being said here. And that's what the author of this is inviting us to do by using the phrase died for. The second thing he points out is that none of this says the name Jesus. The name Jesus does not appear in this kerygma. And Burton Mack says this is one of the biggest differences between the early sayings traditions, whether it's Thomas or Q or some other source. Parts of it appear in the preachings of Peter, which are going to be quoted later on in Clement, and so on. They all talk about Jesus, but something has changed by the time we get to this stage of Christianity, because the early Jesus stuff didn't talk about a Christ, and now we have Christ stuff that's not talking about a Jesus. Now, Paul in his letters will equate Jesus with Christ, but in this early thing that he's quoting, they're not equated. And instead, what's happening is that the concept of Jesus the man is being transformed into a supernatural being, Christ, in the structure, in the structure right here in front of us. In these 7 lines, he's being transformed from a man into a superman. And that's the signal, the change in terminology. Later, when the two are brought together, people will use the phrase Jesus Christ to try to link them up. But this thing has its own structure, independent of the life of Jesus, independent of the passion, independent of what Mark and Matthew and Luke and John say, and so on. The next thing that's really important about this first line is the word sin. Now, we all think we know what it means. But the thing we have to remember is that this is before Paul. It's certainly before Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. It is before even original sin. The notion that the reason Jesus had to die on the cross was so that we could be saved from a sin that we were born into, that had been transmitted to us through our bloodline because of Eve's disobedience of God's commandment not to eat the fruit. That entire thing is not present here. This isn't that meaning. This is an old Jewish concept of sin. I'm glad Ari's on the line. He can talk about this. But there is an earlier Jewish notion of sin that has nothing to do with any of that guilt and redemption stuff. Nothing. It has to do with, are you or are you not following the law of the Torah? As a Jewish person, are you being observant of the law? And when you are doing things outside of the law, that is a sin. Not a Christian sin, not a sin you go to hell for, not a guilt, not a punishment. It's an objective status. It's like saying you have red hair or, hey, you ate shellfish. It's the term sin has that connotation, not the, oh my God, what am I ever going to do? My soul is in peril connotation. None of that's present because, of course, the Jews don't believe in heaven and hell. So for them, sin isn't about the big carrot and the big stick. It's strictly about, are you or are you not in compliance with the Torah? And the examples that Burton Mack cites of this, one of them is, for example, the Jewish concept of sin is applied to all Gentiles. To be a Gentile is to live outside of the Torah. And it's not that you're evil, it's just that that's not the law you follow. And so that implies you have no business entering the temple, for example. The temple is the place for the people of the book who follow the law. Um, Yes, as Joe says in the chat, sin in Judaism asks if you're missing the mark. And of course, what he's referring to is the Greek term hamartia, which we've talked about in the ancient section. Hamartia is the word that's used to translate sin in all of the Greek New Testament. And hamartia is an older word than the New Testament. It goes way back, and it's the term for an archer who misses the mark. And it's associated with the Greek concept of falling short, of striving for something but missing. In fact, it's the center of all storytelling. A willful character ripe for change takes an action that he thinks will make his life better, but that action misses the mark, and instead his life gets complicated. And now we're done with chapter one, and we move on to chapter two of the story. And as Robert McKee writes in the book Story, this is the spine of every story, a whole series of events of hamartia, where the protagonist tries to do what makes sense to him to solve the problems before him, but things don't work out the way he wants. He misses the mark, hamartia. And so in a sense, this is certainly the Greek concept of sin, but this is also in a sense the Jewish concept of sin in abstracto. In concreto, the Jewish concept of sin is you're not following, the Torah, the laws, the codes, the rules of the Torah. And so you're not one of us, you're a different group. Or you're doing something aside from it. Ari says sister word for missing the mark in archery in Hebrew is ket. Am I pronouncing that right? Is it the sound with the ch? Ket? Um,
Pronounced hate.
Say it again.
Hate.
Hate.
There you go. Like hate, but with a ch.
Hate. Thank you. Perfect. Excellent. Yay. All right. So and to make the point, Burton Mack says that there were many Jews in the first century who felt that the Second Temple complex and its whole hierarchy of priests was also sin, that it was also not done in the way that was exactly prescribed in the Torah, that it was a deviation. And so, for example, you remember last week we went through the early Jewish history, and we talked about how the Maccabees, when they threw off the foreign, domination, and they set up the new Hasmonean Judean kingdom, where for the first time in ages the Jews were ruled by themselves again, but they didn't do it the way the first temple had been done. Remember, according to the first temple, the way it was done is on the one hand you had a king, and the king had power but not virtue. And on the other hand, you had the priests, and the priests had virtue but not power. And then the scribes were supposed to link them together. And this created a balance of power in the temple state conception. And this is what the Torah wanted, and advised and advocated. But what the Maccabees did instead is they decided the same person would be the king and the priest. And then they embarked upon a whole series of conquests. They conquer Idumea, they conquer Samaria, they conquer Galilee. And enormous numbers of people, including Jews, are very angry at the Maccabees about this. On the one hand, thank you for, getting us out from under foreign domination. On the other hand, what the hell are you doing? You're in violation of the Torah. And all of this was being in violation of the Torah, whether it succeeded or not, whether people were happy or not, it was seen as sin because it deviated from the Torah. So this first line changes completely when we think that what it's saying is, if we take the gospel interpretation, it's all about, original sin and blah blah blah. But if we take a literal pre-Pauline interpretation, it's not about any of those things. It is about a community that includes Gentiles who, by definition, from the Jewish perspective, they sin because they don't follow the law. They're not circumcised. They're not, observing the right things about cloth or about, dietary restrictions and so on, the sacred baths. They're not doing any of those things. And the question is, can they be part of our community or not? Remember, we talked about in the Q sayings how there is this interest in creating this cosmopolitan community that includes more than just Jews. That the kingdom of God could be Jews and Gentiles, people from all over the world merging and blending together into a community that takes care of each other as an alternative to the Roman Empire, as an alternative to, Alexander and the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, as an alternative to all the other options, this idea of a blending. And why would this be of interest to Jesus? Because Jesus is from Galilee, which is a crossroad of refugees. It's full of people from all over the damn place. And they're trying to figure out how to form a cosmopolitan community. And this line goes directly to that. Do we have permission? Can we be a holy people? Can we be interested in Judaism, even though we're not all Jews and we don't all follow the Jewish law? And this is saying yes, because because Jesus, in the form of the Christ, has redeemed us from not following Jewish law by himself following Jewish law and being faithful to it. And his faithfulness translates into our key to enter the door and belong to the community. So that's really different from the way that we're invited to read that first line when the canonizers take this letter from in front of the Gospels and instead puts it after the Gospels, which causes us to read all of the Gospels' passion and conception of guilt and sin into this line, which Paul never could have written it as, because he's writing decades before that. The next thing that's important about this is, according to the scriptures, is the only phrase that is repeated. According to the scriptures, helps to clearly identify that the first group and the second group of lines are parallels to each other. It glues them together. But it does something else. And it's something really weird. He doesn't say Christ died for our sins as Cephas witnessed firsthand, or as James witnessed firsthand, or as I witnessed firsthand, or as Jesus in visions told me personally. None of those things are present. It's saying the only way that we know that Jesus, and this is the part that's a little, it's not natural for us to read it this way because we've got this gospel interpretation. But if you take it on its own as one of the earliest fragments that we have of early Christianity, what it says is the way that we know that Christ died for our sins is that the scriptures tell us so. Now, the way we're taught in Sunday school to read this is the Gospels tell us so, because the letters come after the Gospels. But in time, the letters come before the Gospels. There are no Gospels. They're going to be written in 65, 70, 80, 90. And this is before 50. I mean, the letter that this is embedded in is from around 50. And it was somebody who taught this to Paul and started him on his ministry sometime in the 40s. Someone is writing this down and they're referring to scriptures. Which scriptures do they mean? Well, biblical scholars generally assume that the scriptures they mean are the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, not the Gospels. And so this is twice saying the way that we know this gospel is that the Jewish scriptures tell us about Jesus, which to us must seem really counterintuitive and strange because we're so used to thinking it's the Gospels that are the scriptures being referred to. But there are no Gospels when this was written. So it has to be the Tanakh. They're saying that if you study the Tanakh the right way, you will find in it that Christ died for our sins and that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day. That's in the Jewish scriptures too, says this gospel, this kerygma. And that he appeared is also in the Jewish scriptures, the Tanakh, according to this gospel. It is compared to the way most people imagine what Paul's writing about today from a modern perspective, from a Sunday school perspective, from what we hear preached to us in church, and from what comes from just the process of reading Gospels first and epistles second. This is a very alien worldview that we're being exposed to. You can learn about Jesus, says these pre-Pauline early Christians, and which Paul completely agrees with. He says over and over in his letters, this is his core message. You can learn about Jesus and what happened to him and what it means to our community by studying the Jewish scripture. It's all in there. Mind-blowingly strange. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Here's a warning from the great Bart Ehrman. You look at the start of Luke, and what does it say? If we take Luke at his word, now the Luke that wrote the gospel is supposed to have been a companion of Paul. But here it is. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled amongst us, just as if they have been handed down to us by those from the first were eyewitnesses. Now, this seems to be saying, Bart Ehrman points this out, that there were Luke is claiming there was a lot of written accounts, but from Luke's standard, just not particularly good ones. Luke supposedly was a stickler for detail and working out whether things were on the money or not. So, when people are talking about, oh, was there a queue? I don't know. Luke's saying there was a multitude of material floating around, but it just wasn't to his standards very good. I hope he wasn't including Matthew in that. Some claim Luke borrowed from Matthew. Well, you have the two different nativities. Now, if Luke launched an investigation and decided that Matthew's nativity was false, it could have been very well the accounts of somebody else and not their Jesus. It would have been very weird if their Jesus had been seen of, the royal line and then spent all his life as a nobody in Galilee. It seems just a bit weird. The other aspect, of course, us apocalypse people, us Judgment Day believers, of course, our position is that the end of the world was coming. But sin is very important in this because you want to be in your best state when the Lord comes. And there's very good reason, if you're rich, well, look, that'd be great if you're going to live for the next 50 years as a rich man, but the world's ending next week. How good is your money going to be in that circumstance? Far better to throw away your money and be sinless for when the Lord comes next week. And I think that was the condition, the state of being. Now, the other thing, the idea that Jesus died for our sins. Well, here we have Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard points out that when we go above being a child, when we become to some degree an adult, being an adult is about taking on responsibilities. And when we fail in our responsibilities, we feel guilt. And this is very much like sin. If you fail in the law, you're going to feel guilt. You've sinned. But this was very important to the apocalyptic Jesus, that you had to have a pure sheep for when the Lord comes. But the crucifixion, us apocalyptists will say Jesus wasn't expecting to be crucified. He even said on the cross, "Why have you forsaken me?" This is a surprise. But such a charismatic figure that even when his prophecies fail, there's a core of supporters that are not going to leave. They're going to try and find reasons or create an account for the way things happened. But the resurrection can be viewed from 2 points of view. Yes, on one level, it's all part of this great mystery of saving man. But on the other level, you could say it is the victory of Jesus over the Romans. The Romans are crucifying Jews all over the place. Well, sorry, you've hit the wrong Jew, sonny. This Jew's going to it's going to defeat your power. But of course, this isn't really Paul's vision of things, is it? But yeah, that's something to be taken into account. Luke's claim that there was a multitude of materials. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I don't think it's possible to read that opening in Luke without concluding exactly what you suggested, which is he read Matthew and went, "This is not doing it for me." He read Mark, which we also know was earlier. It's like, nope. Those are how did he what is his exact wording? Yeah, they're just not adequate. They're not good enough. And he's going to write his own account. It's one of the things we're going to come back to is, when we say that Luke wrote this, we put it in quotation marks. At least biblical scholars put it in quotation marks. What we know must be true is that there was a community that was organized around this gospel, and they produced this. And at some point, it became attributed to Luke, but it's pretty clear the attribution comes later, and we can't rely on this being, written by somebody who was a direct witness to Paul's ministry. But certainly we can say that this was written by somebody who knew about Paul's ministry, as Mark and Matthew were, and that it gets incorporated to some extent. Um,
Well, the
so
suggestion is that, well, yeah, you're talking about Mark and Matthew and a Q, but you going by those lines, I'm saying he's talking about a multitude of materials.
that there's a lot more.
Oh, yeah, a lot more
Yes.
than these greater works.
Yes.
There was a lot of uh, poor works, a lot of poor accounts. I mean, in the very early church, of course, they had witnesses.
Hmm.
Somebody would go around to a church and say, "Yeah, I saw Jesus, and this is what happened."
Yeah.
And of course, there's literate people, and they're going to write down what was said.
Yes.
From the very early in the piece, there'd be a lot of written documents. It wouldn't be like the complete gospels that we got, but a lot of things which were writing down stories and accounts.
Yes.
He's Felix claiming there was a lot of this material.
Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't rare. It wasn't rare to have written accounts,
It's just the
or
survival that's rare.
writings based on the accounts of witnesses.
That's right. That's right. It's only a question of how much that survived to today that's rare. But I think biblical scholars would agree with you. There was a lot of material out there of which we only have fragments now of the early stuff. And so it's part of what biblical scholars try to do is they try to work over the material that has survived for every clue that we can get about what the rest of it might have been like and what else was there. What does it tell us? What was the diversity of thought? So we'll spend some real time on the Gospels after we finish Paul. And we'll spend some real time on Paul after we finish the evidence Paul gives us about the pre-Pauline stage or at least the pre-Pauline stage of the movement that he's a part of. It certainly doesn't account for all the other movements. There's a lot of different groups. So what else is here that's interesting in this? Um, that he was raised on the so there's we shift from active voice that Christ died for our sins to two passive voices that he was buried and that he was raised. And it doesn't tell us who buried him, but we know who has to have raised him. I mean, it has to have been God. Who else can do that? And this is core to Paul's preaching. So there's a we've got some shifting focus here from Christ as an actor to Christ as passive, and then we have God as active and Christ as passive in that he was raised on the third day. And then, ignoring the seventh line for the moment, and that he appeared might have been the earliest stage of this, and that it ended right there. And one of the clues that it might have not originally said that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12 is that Mark, which is the earliest gospel, doesn't say that he appeared to Cephas or the 12. It says, some women came to the empty tomb and they went, whoa. And then it ends with, and they ran away and didn't tell anybody. The end. That's the end of Mark. And the ending that everybody knows, where then the women went and told the disciples, and Jesus met with the disciples after his death and all that, that we know now that was added later. It was added by a scribe who saw that Mark's ending and said, "Are you kidding me? You can't end like that. That's not an ending." Also, what about the unbroken chain of apostolic succession? We need Jesus to have directly talked to the disciples. And so they added the paragraphs at the end. But it didn't originally end that way. It ended that he appeared. We know he appeared because some women saw him. And then that was it. And so that's probably how this originally ended. The earliest gospel probably corresponds to an earlier stage of this kerygma. So this is an interesting little construction here. And this poem is very theological, and it's very, as Sharon points out about Paul, it is very community oriented. And the community orientation, as Burton Mack says, is the whole purpose of this kerygma. It sounds like it's an abstract work of theology on the surface, except that this is a kerygma that is being repeated as a gospel by a community. The community says it over and over, and they keep it over and over. And the reason they do that is this is their justification for being a community. They're saying, we are as holy as the Jews who keep the law because Christ died to give us admission to the holy community. And we remember him and we honor him for allowing us to be a holy community. You might remember a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I was talking about some of the early discussion that Burton Mack does about the history of this period, where he says, this was a time of great angst and confusion. You had all these people whose cultures had developed under the temple state system, not under the city state system of the Greeks, but the older epoch, the temple state system, which Alexander smashed and destroyed all the way from Greece to the boundaries of India. He wrecked all of those old temple state systems and they were gone. And he replaced it with a twisted version of the city state system. The city state is supposed to be something that the local tribes themselves decide, let's stop fighting with each other. Let's come together and create a polis, and we'll make our law together. We'll lift ourselves up from barbarism together and protect each other together. It's something we do. It's an empowering action. But what Alexander did was use the polis as chains. Everywhere he went, he'd set up a polis that was like a military garrison. It was not the local tribes deciding they wanted a polis. It was Alexander and his generals saying, you're going to have one whether you like it or not. And by the way, you don't get a vote. You don't get the franchise. You're not citizens. You're lower class. And the people in charge will be my generals, my soldiers, and immigrants from my lands. They'll be in charge. So the whole thing is being set up as a military conquest schema. And in doing that, not only does it smash the temple state, but not allow the survivors of those temple state cultures to migrate into the city state in a whole way. It doesn't even allow the Greeks to have the city state system that they're used to, because this is a corruption of it. This is a broken form of the city state system. So what you've got by the time that the people before Paul are composing this theological poem is you have vast numbers of people who are dislocated. disenfranchised. They have value systems that are potent and that give meaning to their life, but that used to plug them into the political and religious and economic structure of their communities. And now it doesn't do that because Alexander took all that away. So they have these cultures that are adrift. They're groundless. They're not plugged into the realities of daily life. And they have, as a result, an enormous conflict within themselves. They want to be true to a thing that has no home anymore. And it causes a kind of existential angst and a longing for community that the empty, corrupt Roman Empire just can't provide. As Burton Mack says, nobody could love the Roman Empire. Even the people who were true to the Roman Empire, even Augustus Caesar himself, doesn't talk about how beautiful the empire is. He talks about how beautiful the republic was, how virtuous our forebears were, how we're going to use the empire to try to get back to the spirit of the republic. That we loved. But this thing, it's a hollow doll. It's a punch in the face. You can't love it. The most that can be said for it is that it establishes law and order, but it's just as likely to do that cruelly as it is to do so kindly. So you have these people who need a new political economy. They're deprived of it, first by the Alexandrians and then by the Romans. They have to have it. They don't have it. And as a result, they're all involved in a massive cultural creative ferment. It is utopian. He says you can, and I'm going to call on Ari in just a second, but I want to drop this lure in the water right before I call on him. That we talked about this before. Even in Jewish literature, even in the Tanakh itself, but also in additional apocryphal Jewish literature from the previous century and the first century CE, you find all of this utopian literature that whether it's looking back to King Solomon or King David as a golden age, or whether it's looking forward to a Messiah, it's looking to something other than being under the thumb of the Persians or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Alexandrians or the Romans. That we need to have a new world in which our value system can plug us into the reality of life. And this kerygma, this gospel, according to Burton Mack, although it looks theological on the surface, its function is what Sharon was talking about. It's all about the basis for community. We can come together. We can be holy and not sinning. It can be right for us to do this because of Jesus's death. He was holy according to Jewish scripture, and he opened the gateway for the rest of us and told us to go in. So now it's okay for us to be here and do this. And you're welcome too, oh stranger on the street. Is so long as as long as you love one another and take care of each other, come on in and we'll form a community together. And that's why Paul is quoting this. That's why Paul attaches himself to this. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
There you go. All right. So I have a question, and I've thought about it a bit. So I'll try to keep it short, but there's a lot to it. It's essentially about distinguishing between the temple state and the polis state. And you claim, or not you, but you're representing this information, this point of view, as if there's this temple state before and this polis state afterward. And it's essentially like other things in history where it's like once agriculture was introduced, it pushed off all non-agricultural societies, and therefore somehow as an adaptive mechanism, it was superior, and those who used it thrived and those who didn't thrive. It's like you're talking about, it's like a forward progress kind of thing. But whether or not that is or is not true, I want to understand how are we actually breaking this down. Although obviously all models are wrong, but some are useful. That it seems like before we had these temple states. Well, I was thinking of like the Assyrian Achaemenid empires, things like, if I can say his name right, Ashurbanipal, and then things like, Egypt, big empires for a long time. But these are clearly empires based on religious order rather than political order. And so this is, or rational thinking, right? So this is where I'm thinking that this is what means a temple state. You can have a temple state, but it could be gigantic, right? It seems like that has to be the case. Otherwise, he's making no sense if this only works on a local small scale, right? So what does this mean on a what does this really mean? And my question for you and representing his information then gets full swing is, what does the temple state look like, pre-political state, in terms of like empire to empire, right? Not just like small scale to small scale, but like, some I have my own thoughts, and I've heard Rabbi Sachs talk about it. He never mentioned it in this framework, but it aligns very nicely, so at least works with what he's saying. But he talks about things, religion, that usually the king before used to have this sort of, he was the model of God, and because he was somehow related to God, he had the sovereign right to rule over everybody, and he had superior knowledge and capabilities. This is like almost like in Japan, where the emperor was a god, right? There's something about being godlike was only special for the ruler. Pharaoh in Egypt is the same way. He is this sort of embodiment of the sun and that godness. But then the people were not. But in the modern day, the modern image is that we're all images of God. There's not like one, it's not like, one leader, like all hail Rick, he's the image of God, but we don't have the image of God, right? That Rick guy, he's got it. So Jesus is a little bit like that. He's like weird. He's like, he's the image of God, but we're also the image of God. So it's a little bit like cheating, in my opinion. But it's an interesting way to cheat. I'll give it that. And whatever, as long as the narrative works. And but the point is really asking the hard question in this way: what are the metrics? What will we actually say if we were going to categorize? We had two piles. We wanted to put empires and things in certain cases. What is going to be our definitional working definition, almost like a Banausos way of looking at the world? How would we define a pile of temple state empires versus a pile of how do we generalize that? That's all. So as what Stephen would say, I took way too long to ask a very simple question of how would we generalize this. But yes, thank you for
This is our way, right? This is why we're here to take a long time to find the nugget. And now I'm going to put the penny in the box and say to find the essential part of what we're trying to say, and it's fine. We're exploring together, right? So one of the weaknesses of Kenneth Smith's book, which he would acknowledge, and I think we need to acknowledge, is that it was never intended to talk about the Temple State epoch. And part of the reason is archaeology is uncovering new information every year about the Temple State epoch that we didn't know before. I mean, when he wrote this book in the 1998 to 2000 timeframe, a lot of the research into the Temple State system hadn't been done yet. If you look at historical works written about the Mycenaeans and Minoans compared to the ancient Greeks, you'll find there's an enormous amount of we don't know, we're not sure, we're speculating. So and so said this and we believed it for a century, but then we found out he was full of shit and we have no idea what the truth is, except that it's not what he said. There's a lot of that with the Mycenaeans compared to the Greeks, and there's even more of it with the Minoans compared to the Mycenaeans. The earlier you go into the temple state system, the more we're like, okay, we see these palaces, but we don't see any evidence of kings. What the hell is going on Crete? It's just so confusing. Even the name Minoan is a modern name. They didn't call themselves Minoans. We don't know what they called themselves. It's very confusing. Um, it's like there's speculations, were they some kind of trade empire, and they didn't need a king because everybody just came there and traded, but somehow they were a religious trade empire. I mean, when people try to figure out what's going on, there's there's so much speculation, and a lot of it just ends in we don't know. So when Kenneth is writing, we know a lot less about the temple state system than we do now. As Burton Mack points out, there has been a book written, and I'll try to get the title of it. There has been a book, finally the first definitive for our time book written about the temple state epoch, in which he pulled together every scrap of evidence they had about Persia and Assyria and Babylon and the rest, and put it all together and say, this appears to be the current state of our knowledge. And if I could find that book and we can read that book, we could extend Kenneth's book backwards, maybe, and maybe it would tell us something about how the classical era began, which we currently don't know. I mean, it's one of our we talk a lot about the fact we know how the classical era ended, but we don't know how it began. We know how the modern era began, but we don't know how it's going to end. Only the medieval era do we know both how it began and how it ended. And so we need it to be our key to the other three. And we need these three to just sort of hint at the variety of other worldviews. But we don't really know for sure. Um, the one thing that I will agree with you for sure on is that the notion that the city-state system beat the temple-state system because the city-state system was modern and the temple-state system was obsolete and needed to go. That's a 19th century idea. We don't mostly historians and archaeologists try not to think that way anymore. We recognize that that was a self-serving view of the world. And it was because in the 19th century, Europe was conquering the whole world. Woo, we're the latest and the newest, so we must be better. There must be progress and we must be the best of all. Now, that was the fiction of modernity. And now we're gradually learning that history doesn't work that way. Evolution doesn't work that way. People aren't better than dinosaurs. Dinosaurs just got hit with an asteroid and we haven't yet. It's like the reason they're gone and we're still here has a lot to do with, and now I'm going to quote Joe, contingency versus agency. You could have the finest character and the best agency in the world, but with bad luck, you're gone. You're out. And that's life. Maybe the temple state was a better system than the city state system. But, Philip made a better army and Alexander inherited it and then smashed everybody with it.
Can
Maybe
I
he
push
was,
back
go
on
ahead.
this?
Go ahead.
Okay,
Go
I
ahead.
don't want to speak without raising my hand, but this is good, juicy stuff.
Juicy,
And
juicy.
so it allows me to give my own hypothesis to something else. And it's something like Darwinian, that there needs to be there if you look and see a pattern of what looks like adaptive fitness, and you have to do some mental gymnastics to argue against it. I feel like you have to use Occam's razor that, like, no, it's probably just adaptive fitness. We just can't see the hidden variable behind there that was really keeping that something being sustained, right? So in this case, it would be very likely that it's not that the temple state is superior to the city state. It's somehow that the city state is able to prey on and defeat the temple state repeatedly over and over. That does something that the other one can't defend against. That's more of a natural way of looking at it. It's not like one's better or different, but there's something that gets. And I make an argument with this, like for agriculture, there's a really strong mystery that will probably, like you're saying, never be proved, but there are definitely reasonable hypotheses out there. But I've actually never heard mine, and I'm really surprised. And it makes me wonder if it's just like I'm a generalist and I think in other ways. But a lot of anthropologists claim lots of different reasons, like alcohol or religion. Religion's a kind of reasonable one. Um, because you need to get centralized in order to get people to be religiously together, and therefore you have a lot of resources you need to get all together for some reason that you never had to before, and then agriculture just as a byproduct of that. But I don't like the byproduct argument because it doesn't lead to causality, like wherever you see agriculture it pushes off the other. And so I made a different argument like this, if you'll let me, that has to do with something in warfare. Is I'm looking at it like from a natural species competing. And essentially, I look at it that agriculture allowed you to invent the modern or the military technology of what we call siege warfare. It allowed you to take a sack of grain, maybe like 5, 10 warriors, however much small the scale is, but very little compared to your enemy, and go camp on the high ground nearby and wait for them to need to forage because they have to get food every 3 days. They cannot live without it. While you can sit there for only like maybe 2 weeks, all you need is 2 weeks of supplies. And at some point, they have to make themselves vulnerable to your attack, which you can just go in and do stuff because they need to go get food. So you can just out ration them. And they're usually the simplest option, especially if this is your culture and you have more of a mobile mindset. You'll be like, oh, I'll just go somewhere else. I'll just go somewhere else. These guys are sitting there. I don't want to pick a fight with them. They clearly are not actually being terribly aggressive, but they're just camping out nearby, right? And if you had even a small, this leads to an advantage in good territory, which allows you to have a surplus of a few extra warriors or whatever, these scouting groups. And you could like essentially, it's almost like, again, I see military technology being really successful when you can have the concentration of power, which is smaller groups of people being able to defeat larger groups of people, right? If that, once you got that going on, that really allows military power. And makes me, sorry to get into another question about like, I think I'm going to have to disagree with Hannah Arendt here that she says violence is not power. It's a different kind of power, but it is in terms of physical systems, it's energy throughput. So it's like if you can really concentrate your energy and really be disastrous, but it's maybe short term, it's like a hand grenade, it'll explode on you too. But at the same time, you look at agriculture, something like this, if it really was something like siege warfare, that was able to push off any
Right.
sort of non-agrarian society.
Right.
And then, you have a good argument that this type of thing really is an interesting form of power. So Anyways,
Yeah.
that's me. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ari. But to be clear, Arendt would agree with you. She says
Oh,
violence is not authority. It is power.
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, of course. Well,
It
but
is power. It's just
mm,
not authority.
yeah,
Authority
I
is the
got it
thing you
wrong. Yeah, I meant to
recognize in
say.
others.
Yeah, we should discuss that because it seems like a form of authority too, if it means survival versus not survival. But
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a discussion we can have another time.
yeah, but that'll
It'll
be
come
fun.
up a
We'll
lot.
table that for later.
We won't forget. It's a recurring theme. So, I want to wrap us around here partially with what Stephen just posted in the chat. He says, don't leave out the effect of the Mongols. And again, echoing Joe's theme of contingency versus agency, we would all be speaking Mongolian today if they hadn't gone home for a state funeral and then been too bored with the idea of finishing us off. I mean, we had no response. It is not the case that the Mongols stopped because we defeated them. We didn't. We were utterly defeated. They went halfway through Europe and then they had to go home for a state funeral. And then he thought, Jesus Christ, are we going to go back to that pigsty, all these ignorant savages wallowing around in pig shit, and we're going to conquer them for what? So we can wallow in pig shit, or we can stay here in our our beautiful yurts with cosmopolitan scholars from all over the world who speak to us about their religions. And I would rather stay here. Why would I go to that terrible place? And that is the only reason we don't speak Mongolian today. I mean, when they came conquering through, they won. They won every battle. They were just we had no answer. And it goes to this issue. On the one hand, as Stephen's pointing out, as Joe's pointed out before, moderns don't like to admit how much of our current situation is strictly contingent. It just happened that way. Things could easily, with a feather drop, things could have been different, right? I mean, one cranky person in the Mongol hierarchy who really wanted to finish us off, if somebody was really ticked at us and said, I don't care if it is filthy, we've got to teach these guys a lesson, that would have been it for us. There just didn't happen to be anybody present to say that. And another example I'm going to cite before I call on Stephen, I'll put it in the chat myself. There's this book by Ronald Wright called Stolen Continents, and it's about the history of how North and South America came to be acquired by the Europeans. And a lot of what's in it, he does 3 from North America and 2 from South America. Or is it the other way around? He does the Incas, the Mayas, the Aztecs, um, and I forget the Cherokee is one of them, I think, and the third one is probably from the um, why am I drawing a blank? The Iroquois Confederation. Iroquois Confederation. So 2 from North America, if you don't count the Aztecs and Mayas. Anyway, what you learn from these 5 stories, he does before European contact, how the fight went, and then today. He gives you all 3 perspectives for each of those 5 groups. And what you learn is a lot of history nobody ever told us, right? What everyone told us is a very simple story of, we won. Europeans came here and we won. And maybe there was a plague, and maybe sometimes we gave them plague blankets and alcohol, but we won, and that's the end. And what that story doesn't include is all this stuff from the personal letters of George Washington, Cortez, Pizarro, and others, where they say they were losing. Right. That they would, and it makes perfect sense. These Europeans are invading, the eastern continental forests where the Iroquois know every branch, every gully. They know every plant that's poisonous. They know where all the wasp nests are. They know the whole place like the back of their hand. And here's Washington, who's a real estate speculator. We don't talk about that part. He runs out there and tries to steal land from the Indians and then sell it to colonists. And they're kicking his butt, and they drive him all the way back to the coast. Washington, and the way we know is not because, liberals say so. George Washington says so. But they were dying of the plague while they were beating us, and their numbers were falling. And so they could win the battle but lose the war. And that story gets repeated it gets repeated in the story of the Cherokee. It gets repeated in the Aztecs and the Mayas. We learn about Cortez and his cannons and the superstition of the Aztecs and all that. But what we don't hear is the battle in which the Aztecs pushed Cortez and his people all the way back to their ships. That's not part of the history we like to talk about. But it's in the records, and this author talks about it. If these people had not been vulnerable to these European diseases, they would have pushed us right off the continent. In battle after battle after battle, they were winning. And it makes sense that they'd win. I mean, a sword, A gun, a cannon, that's of a certain amount of use, but so is knowing your terrain in a way that your enemy never ever can. They were winning, but they were also having their population fall while they were winning because they were vulnerable to a plague. Contingency. If it weren't for the plague, there might not be any white people in North and South America. And again, we don't like that. We want it to be destiny. We were destined to be here because we're better, because we replace our inferiors and we're the superior ones. We like that story. So we tell that story over and over and over and over and convince ourselves, even while George Washington's own letters contradict it. He was the eyewitness. He was the beaten man who was pushed back, and he said it happened. And we're all like, I don't want to look at that. I don't want to know that. I want a great march of progress. So, so I'm with Ari on this. You know, it's just like when we look at these questions of why was Alexander able to smash the temple states? Why were so many people thrown into confusion? And why did the Romans then beat, the Seleucids and expand and take over? It's easy to think it's because that's how the story is supposed to go. Whether it's because the forces of history or progress or God's will or what have you, it's easy to say it needs to be this way because that's the story. And what's much harder is to understand we live in a vast, complex cosmos in which some things happen because of our agency, but other things happen despite our agency, happen because of contingencies that are outside of our control that easily could have gone a different direction. So, especially given how little we know about the temple state system, the truth is we can't fully understand why they were in the shape they were at the time that Alexander and his army met them. We can analyze military tactics in some cases and say, well, maybe this battle went to Alexander because of X, Y, or Z, but we can't say why the temple state fought battles that way. Why didn't they fight a different way? We don't know. We just don't know enough. We're dealing with the edges of our historical understanding, and just like we are with the early Christians, we're taking the fragments we've got and trying to piece them together and figure out who these people were and what they did. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, it's something I observe in history, and I don't know if it's a contingency, but it's there. You've got the old worlds, from China through Asia to Europe. Now, the part that became powerful, Western Europe, was the one part of that world that was never occupied by the Mongols. This is something you hear it in the accounts of people, Europeans, when they did go to the East. They were saying that, there was a thriving material culture, but something's knocked these cultures flat at some point, was the impression you get. For example, in Europe, was more or less everybody was being trained to be a scholar. Only so many really made it, but even if you went to Sunday school, you're being trained to be a scholar. And, you come to places like India, which was recently suffering the long distance effect of the Mongols. You had the Mongols had just invaded, there was constant warfare. And it seemed to be that scholarship side of societies does very badly in warfare. The scholars disappear. The work gets put aside. The glorious Mongolian occupation of China saw, they believe, the population drop from 100 million to 40 million in the course of a century. So it's a thesis, and I don't know how worthy the thesis is, but this was a tremendous effect, which might have been, it was still there, still intense at the time the Europeans were starting to make their way around the Orient. That's it. You just see it. It's the picture's just there. This Western Europe was the one place that was never occupied by the Mongols, even Eastern Europe, Russia. It was a mess. They had been occupied by the Mongols. So, there was, Genghis Khan might have left a huge echo in history. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I could tell you what my history teacher at the University of Washington said, which I've never read anything that refuted it to this day about this very question. Just because it's, although it's a little off, it's also right on. It's about this question of contingency. And there's this book called How the Irish Saved Civilization and by Thomas Cahill. And it's a number of historians critique it as being an oversimplification or making its case too strongly or what have you. But Bridgman and others think that it's not entirely wrong in its core thesis. And its core thesis goes like this, especially when you combine it with Bridgman's interpretation. It says, on the one hand, the monastic tradition in which people set up monasteries in the countryside instead of cathedrals in the cities. And these monasteries in the countryside became centers of learning in Christianity, and they were all copying each other's scrolls. There was no single library of Alexandria you could sack in Europe to destroy the intellectual framework of Western civilization. This is Bridgman's thesis, Professor Bridgman's thesis from the history course. He said, and the result was if you wanted to get rid of Western civilization, you would have to finish the conquest. You can't do it halfway. You'd have to burn every last monastery all the way out to the Western Irish Islands. And if you missed even one, it would all come back again because they're all copying each other's books. They've all got piles and piles and piles of books. And they would just start founding more monasteries again. And what Cahill's argument is, the monastic tradition doesn't start in Rome. It's not a core part of the original imperial religion that's approved by Constantine and so on. It is instead a weird Celtic splinter group that focuses on the very thing that the main Roman religion was weak on at the time. The Roman religion at the time, we're now talking about the 500s, 600s, 700s, 800s, 900s, the period through the Dark Age. What they're doing is they're getting their cute, educated Christian daughters to marry pagan kings. And then using the bedroom and sex, they try to convert them over from paganism to Christianity. But failing that, they can at least ensure that the king's own children are raised as Christians, even if he never converts. And so all these kingdoms, one by one, that they are becoming Christian. It was a clever strategy, and it was based on how Rome tended to do things too. I mean, Rome wielded its own women exactly the same way in their dynastic goals. So, but the Irish, according to Cahill, saw that the weakness of the strategy is you end up with a kind of Christianity we wouldn't recognize today. It's a kind of Christianity that is strictly an urban upper class Christianity, in which all of Europe is still heathen, except for this residue on top that have all the money and power. But they're the only ones that are really Christian. And other people might be coerced into going through the motions, but they don't really believe because they recognize it's being imposed on them from on top. And this Christian religion is not oriented towards the thousands of years old village cycles of, the seasons, which are utterly important for agriculture. When do you plant? When do you harvest? How do you make it through the winter and cheer each other up? All this ancient heathen culture that's the metabolism of Europe that allows it to survive. And so Irish figure that out because they're not urban, they're a rural people. And so when they start converting to Christianity, they set up monasteries throughout Ireland and Scotland. And then they look at Europe and say, good God, you're basically still a heathen continent. We're going to send missions to Europe and convert Europe to Christianity. But we're not going to do it the Roman way, which isn't working. We're going to do it our way, which is we're going to go to the villages by setting up monasteries in the rural countryside. And ultimately, that's what they do. I was just reading 2 weeks ago about the invention of letters with accents, like C with the hatchek on top, the little, like in the name Dvorak, the R has the hatchek on top. And the Slavic languages all do this. It's an extension of the Latin alphabet. I was reading about how that got created as a way to try to fit languages that have lots and lots of sounds into a Latin alphabet that only has a few letters. It's like, how could you do it? You need a little indicator or mark that says I'm gonna piggyback more letters off of this same letter depending on what mark I put on it. And it was the Bohemian Renaissance that came up with this idea. And when trying to trace, well, where did they get the idea specifically? The original version was dots and accent marks, the écoute from French. Where did they get this idea? I mean, where did they look for inspiration? And the only other language ever, the only everyone's had lots of theories about this. We know who did it and when, but we don't know what he was inspired by. And if you read Wikipedia, they'll all say it's a mystery. But there's a guy who did a research paper and he studied all of the options and all the possibilities. And what he concluded is it came from Old Irish. It came from Old Irish. And everyone's like, well, that's insane. Ireland is like the far edges of the world. How would this Czech guy know anything about Irish? And the answer is, well, doesn't Czechoslovakia have monasteries? All these monasteries all over Europe were set up by the Irish. And they copied their texts. There's old Irish texts all over Europe and all these to this day, all over Europe, and these monasteries are old Irish texts. And in fact, if you want to study the corpus of Irish texts, it's a waste of your time to go to Ireland because most of them are in mainland Europe. So all these people diligently copying old Irish Christian texts, one after another, in monastery after monastery. So the challenge for the Mongols is if they wanted to really stomp it out, they would have had to go to every last backwater rocky island full of seagulls or puffins and find the tiny little monk in a scriptorium who's busily copying all of Western civilization onto the new set of documents to pass out to the next monastery. And they just didn't, they're just like, I can't be bothered. That's just exhausting. And, why do I want a rock full of bird shit? I'm going home. Anyway, the point is, the history is really interesting. It's full of these contingencies. It's full of these accidents. And if the accidents had come out slightly differently, then the impact would have been gigantic. This is what they call the butterfly effect, right? A butterfly flaps its wings on one side of the planet and there's a hurricane on the other side because of all the tiny changes that add up that tilt an outcome one way or another that was delicately balanced. An enormous amount of history is just delicately balanced. And so that's what we see in this conquest of the temple states, as far as we know, is it could have gone a different way. We don't really know what the factors were. And it could easily have been the same for the early history of Christianity. We, as with the history of the temple states, so with the history of the first 70 years of Christianity, as Stephen points out, there is evidence that suggests there used to be an enormous amount of evidence. A lot of documents were written, and we have hardly any of them left. We're missing most of the picture. It's a puzzle where we have 15, 25 pieces out of 1,000. And we're just trying to guess what was going on. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I had some interesting thoughts about how this reminds me of how Judaism survived when the temple was destroyed and what the rabbis did. This was very clever stuff. And essentially, I actually asked my rabbi about some of this stuff, and he used a really great metaphor that I thought was really interesting. And then Rabbi Sachs is much more lofty and uses language like when the holiest temple, that every synagogue could be a temple, and even every home could be a synagogue. Every table that you ate dinner at was a place that resembled the place where the Holy of Holies were offered. So it's basically every person, and Rabbi Sachs uses the language that everybody could internalize that which was external, and therefore it was transmitted reality. Is very nice language. But my rabbi said something much more practical. He's like, no, it's something, if you want to conceptualize why it works, and what I'm doing now to this day is we're just making franchises. We're just able to franchise this instead of having one giant like Costco where everybody has to go to. What if there were a lot of tiny, small, independent Costco franchises, right? Or you had to follow the playbook, right? And so this is what the monastery is. The monastery is the franchise with the playbook. And anytime there's a new text, they all get the update new text, right? They make the copies and they're working hard, and right. So this is really cool where but it's also interesting that I'd imagine the corporate leadership is also kind of distributed and non-local. It's if one monastery starts doing something really cool, everybody else is like, oh, those guys are cool. We're gonna get their books and we're gonna copy them. We're gonna learn what they're learning, right? And so it's like this is where also this is the difference between sorry to wrap my sacks here, but this is the only place I've ever heard before. The difference between power and influence. Power is a zero-sum game, but influence is not a zero-sum game. And this is where education is about influence, because you can share it with other people and still have it, right? So it expands beyond what it is, right? As opposed to power is you have it or don't. And economics and politics are zero-sum games, but education and theoretically religion is a non-zero-sum game. So this is the idea that you can, and it's also, it's interesting, I mimic this to the prefrontal cortex, is it does things by influence, not power. And this gets really to like, now we're going back to Hannah Arendt again. So let's not go down that route. But just to say that I find that this strategy seems very similar to what at least my culture, but I'm guessing lots of cultures have done this sort of franchise. It doesn't seem like it's a right. I mean, I guess you have the monks in the East that all do this stuff, right? So this is the same kind of
Yeah, that's right.
right. Polynesians, when they did their crazy island hopping, that
Same
must have been
thing.
franchises, right? So
Exactly.
I mean, I guess
Exactly.
cells are franchises. They just make copies of each other, right? So like biology cells just franchise. So yeah, it follows the biological model. Very nice. Okay.
It's a great model.
It's a great model.
Yeah, after we get through some of the early Christian material, the next phase that we'll go into is going to be the early desert mothers and fathers, the people who were sick of civilization and just went out into the desert, especially in Egypt, but also elsewhere. And that very quickly became a franchise system because they were like, "Ooh, look what Og do." Me too. I also want to go in the desert and learn to be holy, and it's you're right. There's a franchising thing going on. And I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that it's the Irish who set up the franchise of the monastic system in Europe. I mean, after all, a few thousand years later, it's that Scottish person who sets up the franchise of those fine Scottish restaurants all over the world, McDonald's, right? Ray Kroc creates the again Scottish franchise.
Is it a weird coincidence that Ireland is where all the corporations go to because they don't have any corporate tax, right? Isn't that something like that?
Yes, yes. Some kind of Irish theme underwriting all of this. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Know much about franchises, and when you mention Scots that franchised the modern world, I was really thinking of people like John Locke and David Hume and whatever. But this idea of agency and contingencies, one I'm very fond of, but I was thinking of something else the other day in conjunction with that, and I think it's Hegel in the Philosophy of Right, where he says everything that is right, by which it means that it has some reason for being. There's some reason it existed. It made it through the agency and contingencies of history and was preserved. You know, where a lot of modern Hegelians, they want to go into the future. They want to become progressives and think they can understand the contingencies in advance, which is not so good. But looking back, even through all the Huns, the Khans went back to select, the great Genghis died or whatever, and they went back and had to select a new leader, attend the funeral and select a new leader, and smallpox wiped out South America and stuff like that. But still something made it through. And I think Hegel's viewpoint is not that, well, these things we just don't know how they turn out. We need to understand what the antithesis and the thesis, what their collision produces, what was preserved by that synthesis, and why was it strong enough or powerful enough in some sense to be preserved. And this is very critical, I think, when we start saying let's get rid of stuff. This is what's obstructing us. We want to clear out sort of the landscape, the political landscape or the religious landscape or whatever in some area, and say we'll reconstruct without understanding the strengths that led to the preservation of what is. It's not saying, he's not like, I don't think Hegel's quite like, you know, this is the best of all possible worlds. He's saying of all possible worlds, this one made it through. And we need to understand what allowed that to happen. What were its internal strengths that allowed that to happen? And so then now we can go on to devastating everything.
Hooray, devastation. So again, for those who haven't been on these calls before, it was Joe Bullock, who's on the call right now, who gave us our seminar's recurring theme of agency versus contingency. And it took us a while to find in F.M. Cornford's books that Thucydides has the same dialectic, which he calls gnome for agency versus touche for contingency. So this theme that Joe, yeah, hi Joe, this theme that Joe gave us has evidently been, running back in existentialist philosophy for thousands of years, and kudos to Joe for putting us on it. It's become, we talk about it almost every week now. So let's wrap up our discussion of this first fragment of pre-Pauline discussion. There's a couple things more to say about it. One of them is the word raised, and that he was raised on the third day. And we all assume we know what that means. But Burton Mack says that the standard understanding among biblical scholars today is that it doesn't mean what we think it means. And the reason that we don't know that is that we don't, as Kenneth Smith argues, we don't know enough about the ancient classical worldview to understand how they would have reacted to what's being said here. We think it means resurrected. But the problem is, when we think resurrection, we're thinking about something completely different from what anybody in Jesus's time would have thought by the word resurrection. In Jesus's time, the Greeks and the Jews would have agreed that any kind of resurrection is a resurrection of the spirit, not of the body. Both of them saw the body as corrupt. And there were all kinds of codes and rules about how you are to handle this corrupt, empty vessel after the death of a person in order to avoid being contaminated yourself. It was an unclean thing. And there's a great deal in the Torah about this, and the Greeks have it too. And they revere the resting places of their dead, but they also don't, hang out with the bodies. So to both the Jews and the Greeks, two of the main contributions to the Galilean population at the time, the idea that your body gets up and you're still in there after you died is it's as gross as eating poop. I mean, it is just gross. It's gross at a level we can't imagine. That's like, nobody would think, God, I hope that happens to me. They don't think that's horrible. You want me to be a zombie? That's disgusting. And the it's a radical thing as a result that this kerygma is doing. Because a lot of what the kerygma is doing is trying to unite the worldviews of two different groups, the Gentiles, which largely includes Hellenized peoples, and the Jews. It's trying to bring them together to make it possible for them to be in a shared community that takes care of each other. But it's doing this through a mechanism that is a direct affront, kind of at the most visceral level, to both cultures. This concept of Jesus's body with his soul in it got up after being dead for 3 days. I mean, both the Greeks of the time and the Jews of the time would be turning away, making retching noises at this proposition. You're not going to bring, that's not going to bring either of them in. And so as a result, this is a far more radical thing to do than we can possibly imagine from our modern perspective. And how do we know that that's what they meant? If resurrection meant resurrection of the spirit, how do we know that this kerygma isn't saying he was raised in the spirit and that they saw his spirit? Well, as Burton Mack says, we know because the verb raised in Greek is not the verb for resurrection. It's the verb for waking somebody up. It's either what happens when you get up out of bed or when somebody, shakes your shoulder to wake you up and you get up out of bed. They mean woke up. So this spirit is still in his body. So it clearly does mean the thing that's deeply offensive to Greeks and Jews. There's no getting around it. That's the core of this message, is this really icky, gross thing. And it's hard for us to gauge why they would do that. What does that mean? So one of the things that Burton Mack argues about this is that structurally, with these two halves, they're marrying together a Greek part, and the belief in the resurrection of the body was standard among the Jews, says Stephen. Well, the question is it the same body or is it a renewed body, a refreshed body? I've read that the Jewish interpretation was that you would get a cleaned up, refreshed body, not the exact same body that's been moldering away in the grave. But I'm not an expert on this. I'm quoting Burton Mack here. But his argument is that there are basically two core concepts that are being brought together in this kerygma, and one of them is from Greek culture, and that is the Greek myth of the noble death. Socrates is a classical example, but there's dozens of them, and everybody in this area at this time knows all of these stories. It's one of the most common stories you get from the Greeks, the noble death. And the death ennobles the person, and it ennobles what they stood for. Socrates ennobles philosophy by dying for it. And that we know that it has that impact because it still has that impact to us today. That hasn't changed in 2000 years. It's that big ringing feel of, my God, he must have been committed. I mean, he must have really believed. You can't come away from this thinking Socrates didn't feel anything about philosophy. You're like, he was willing to die for it, and he did. Even though he had every opportunity to get out of it, he still did it anyway. So that's one. And then the other comes from the Jewish side. And it makes sense that they would merge these two things if they're trying to create a community of mixed Jews and Gentiles. So the other half is the Jewish myth of the effective martyr and the persecuted sage. And the Jews have both of these stories. So the classic example on everybody's minds of the effective martyr is the Maccabees. The Maccabees. And there is a story running around at the time about 7 brothers who died for the law, and by doing so, they assured the defeat of the foreign powers that had taken over Judea, and that's how they freed us. So this idea that martyrdom can be effective, that's not just a noble death that ennobles what you stand for, but it can change the world. If you're willing to martyr yourself in the right time, in the right way, for the right reason, you can change the course of history. This is a Jewish idea that is very present in their lives. I mean, the Maccabees, nobody's forgetting about the Maccabees at the time of Jesus. It's on everybody's brain. And then there's a similar one that goes hand in hand with that, another Jewish tradition, which is of the persecuted sage. And there are so many examples in Jewish literature. I mean, in Joseph, in Esther, and Daniel, a lot of the Psalms include this, and it has stages. It has episodes in the plot of the persecuted stage. First is the unjust charge of disloyalty that puts the sage into the hands of a foreign despot who threatens to kill him. And this happens over and over in Jewish literature. And then the next stage, there's a it's a that's a trial gone wrong, and then there's a revelation or discovery of the sage's piety and loyalty. The despot discovers he was wrong, and that the person he's accused is actually good, and true. And then the third part, this revelation results in the rescue of the righteous man and his elevation to a position of honor. And this completes the story by having the trial go rightly in the end. It's the vindication of his righteousness. And the wisdom of Solomon, a major piece of Jewish literature at the time, is a classic example of the persecuted sage, who is redeemed in the end, through these stages. And if you think about the Passion story, that comes later in Mark and Matthew and Luke and John, the persecuted sage is all over this, and the effective martyr is all over this, and the noble death, the Greek noble death, is all over this. And Burton Max says that the standard argument about this little pre-Pauline poem that Paul has captured for us, critical part is that it merges them in the first stanza and the second stanza. It marries together the Greek and the Jewish tradition into one person, and says all of these stories, all three of these traditions, all apply to this one person, and therefore this person is important, and therefore his teachings are important, and therefore the community that we build around this person is sanctified and vindicated. And so to people before Paul and to Paul, that's the meaning of these 7 lines that are because of these traditions we're drawing on, because of the holiness of this and the ennobling of it and the vindication of it. It demonstrates that we have a right to come together as a community, and nobody can criticize us for it. We're a righteous community. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Sure, yeah. I was going to say there's a few other components to this recurring theme that are interesting. One is that their female wife is masked as their sister, or in Mordecai and Esther's situation as his niece or something, which apparently, because they all married their cousins, that this is a half truth, and that they're all coming from different tribes, so they're all kind of related. So when they say it's their sister, it's an exaggeration that they're related, essentially, and that they're number one. This is where how, like, in the rabbinic literature, how they try to deal with the fact that these people who are supposed to embody truth and are like Superman or George Washington, who never told a lie, right? How did they possibly tell lies? And so the idea is more, as again, wisdom literature is, it teaches us that when your life is in danger and it's like war rather than peace, then you're allowed to lie, because then it's a totally different situation. You're not working with someone who's in good faith or trying to help you. You're like, then it's not cool, because then you're taking advantage of someone. But if you're just trying to survive and you think they're going to kill you and take your wife for their harem, then you're allowed to say it's your sister, and then they take her for the harem anyways, and then bad things happen to them, like with Esther or with Sarah or all these people, right? So it's always the same thing. And it's really interesting that apparently there's a couple of things Rabbi Sachs likes to point out that most people don't so much. But you said this a little bit with the families that are going into the wilderness to become holy. It's supposed to be a protest against empire, and a protest against slavery, and that it's supposed to be against a protest. It's supposed to be a manual on how to build a free society where everyone is a citizen in the image of God, as opposed to just the guy in charge. But he has also said it's a critique on power and alpha male status in a lot of these kingdoms in terms of procreation. That it means that every man gets, if everyone's in the image of God, then every man and everyone can get married. That means every man has a chance to have a mate. Instead of just one man out of 1,000, and the rest are horribly wanting to conquer and obviously do a lot of aggressive stuff to get access to mates. So everyone gets a mate. And then in terms of the females, each female gets a complete share of a quote unquote husband in a non, he calls it, which is really interesting how idyllic he is, and he says in a non-vestigial institutional version of marriage where you have some sort of patriarch or dominancy. But you see that marriage has been like that way forever. So he's like, if you could just get rid of this patriarchal aspect of it, then you just have, ideally one woman, one man, and they each have an equal share in each other. And this force gives them the friction they need to grow with each other, as opposed to just being on their own, and yada yada, all this stuff that marriage is very idyllic. But he says explicitly that it's really interesting here is again, all of these are protests against certain things, and this is a protest against the sexual idea of conquest. Just take some stranger's wife and kill him and put her in your harem. And I can, because justice is not about what's right, it's about what's might, right? And so it's interesting. I just find that there's these other themes. So I would just point out the idea of the sister instead of the wife.
Yes.
I'm wondering if Jesus has all this with Mary, something like this idea of a weird relationship, that maybe he was really with her, and you have to throw in this idea that he was protecting her or himself, so he says she was something else. You could add all these things in, because of the patterns that they were supposed to fit in terms of the archetype.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Ari.
Yeah.
I also want to note what Stephen put in the comments, that there were Jewish sects that believed in the resurrection of the Bible. There's some that do and some that don't. Burton Mack is sort of oversimplified in his argument, but some of these sects that believe in it rose. They arose during the time of the Maccabees as a reaction against the Maccabees, and this is when we get the Pharisees rising. This is also when we get the Qumran people who made the Dead Sea Scrolls. They leave the temple, they go out into the desert to the great shelf above the Dead Sea, and they set up their little commune to try to be purer than what the Maccabees are doing and document what they think that purity looks like. And so, these kinds of peripheral movements within Judaism, could have contributed to this idea that's in this pre-Pauline kerygma. Yeah, Stephen, thank you for pointing that out.
Can I make a quick comment about that?
Please, yeah.
Rabbi Sachs says, from a strong anthropological point of view, that these sects remind us a lot of what you have for like fundamental Baptists now, in the sense now that they're literal and not from some sort of institutional tradition. They're very much just trying to take a literal, fundamental approach. So you just read the text and literally do this. And so he writes like several whole books on this whole problem with, like, if religion is just looking at a book and trying to tell you exactly what it is and it's an instruction manual, it's all, you got it wrong, and your version of religion is probably not going to last very long. And that's what you see. These sects are like really extreme, and they try to do some stuff that's very literal. Like, for instance, it's, this idea of being pure. They try to not go to bathroom at all on the Sabbath, like for 24 or 5 hours, right? So like, obviously this is not going to, right? These kind of things are, because they think they're trying to take it really literally. And so again, it's just like, they're not, I would say, argue from our type of language, they're not using sofer sune. So this is where because you're taking it literally, you're throwing sofer sune out the door, and therefore. So, anyways, that's the argument for why these sects do these things as well.
Thank you, Ari. I'm going to do the second pre-Pauline fragment more briefly. It doesn't take as much time to explicate. I mean, we've already seen some of the strangeness of this first pre-Pauline fragment in Corinthians, as we look at it from outside the context of the Gospels and imagine what would people in the 40s have meant by these words. So now here is another fragment. This one is in Romans. And once again, basically Paul is very clear that this is some of the early teaching that he is passing along and preserving and not allowing it to be lost. And so he's giving us a portrait not only of his own beliefs, but of something that predates him. And so that I think both fragments, the one from Corinthians and Romans, push back into that same era of the early Gospel of Thomas sayings and of the Q sayings. This is in the decade after Jesus' death. These are the kinds of things people are talking about. So the second fragment, it's weird. It documents a stage in the development of early Christian thinking that appears to predate the kerygma. It seems to be an older version. I'm dropping a little text there out of Burton Mack's thing, and now I'm going to put the poem itself in after that. There's been a little bit of editing in here, as suggested by the text, to show, on the one hand, what Sam Williams's 1975 detailed study of this passage suggests the original wording might have been. That's what'll be in parens. He's got little edits that Williams has made, and then in square brackets, Burton Mack himself has put in some clarifying text just to help us understand what the intent might have been. But it again is in two passages, two matching halves. And the first half is, in times past, God overlooked the sins of the Gentiles. And of course, sins is to be understood in that Jewish sense, not the Christian sense. It's to be understood in that sense of the failure to comply with the Torah, living in a way that cannot allow them to be part of the Jewish community because they don't follow Jewish law. But now God has regarded Jesus' death as a means of expiation because of, and then the third line is, his faith is the text we have now. But Williams says almost certainly the original wording was his faithfulness. That is, his fidelity, Jesus's fidelity to Torah law is God regards Jesus' death as a means of expiation because of Jesus's faithfulness to the Torah. He, and then Burton Mack says, God, we're not talking about Jesus here, but God, he did this to show his righteousness. And then the fifth line, and to justify or make righteous is Williams's interpretation of the justice. This is where the whole argument hinges, and we'll come back to this. And to justify or make righteous the one whose faithfulness stems from, and then the last sixth line is Jesus's own faithfulness. Now, this equation, this poem, this theological poem, makes even clearer the early Christian intent that Sharon was talking about. This entire focus is on community. How can we build a community? How can we come together? What is the justification for Gentiles who don't follow the law to be in close sacred community with Jews who do follow the law? And as you might remember, we talked about a few weeks ago that part of the result of all these people being uprooted and dislocated from their old temple cultures is that they were searching for solutions. And one of the ways they searched for solutions was to form clubs. And Burton Mack gave us a bunch of language around clubs, associations, and so on, like the Elks or the Eagles or you know the Masons or what have you. These groups that are common shared interest groups. They get together and they have meals together and they talk about things and they explore the ideas of how can we live together. And it's that, you know, Burton Mack says that the standard understanding is that in this era, a lot of this was going on, and the problem got raised: are we allowed to associate together? Because you got a lot of Gentiles who were very curious about the Jewish religion and the Jewish culture. Because they'd look at the Jews, who, by the way, are coming out of the Maccabees period, remember? They're looking at the Jews and saying, you guys seem to know who you are. The rest of us are all, I mean, I'm from I was from Assyria. I was from Persia. I was from Babylon. We are all adrift and lost. And we're trying to get our feet under us and figure out how to form communities. But you seem to know how to do it. Can we join your community? And the scholarly argument is that this provoked a crisis among the Jews, which is, I don't know, can they join our community? They really seem to want to, and there's an awful lot of them. But on the other hand, our law is very important to us. The Maccabees literally just struggled to get us a situation where we could all be true to our own law. And now here's all these people who say they love us and want to be like us, but they don't follow our law. What do we do? And you know, the early Galilean, early Christian communities, you know, evidently answered this by saying, well, we're going to find a way to justify having Jews and Gentiles be in association with each other in little sacred communities. And this right here, which Paul quotes, and this, so this is in Romans. This is in Romans 3:24 to 26 and 4:25. And it's studied in depth in a book by Sam Williams from 1975. And then Burton Mack is talking about this and sharing this in his book, Who Wrote the New Testament. His first chapter on Paul explores these early pre-Pauline fragments that are contained within Paul. So anything that's in parens in this has been added by Sam Williams in his attempt to by studying the language to reconstruct what it might have been before it got copied and copied and copied and copied. Because of course, faithfulness means something powerful in a Jewish context, in a very early Christian context, that it isn't going to mean in the second and third and fourth centuries in a Christian context, where now Christianity has transformed into a religion that's all about faith, not faithfulness. And this is why William says probably this used to say faithfulness, not faith, given the context and given the fragments of Greek, you know, and why would you choose this Greek word versus that Greek word? If you wanted the whole explication, you'd have to read the 1975 book by Sam Williams. You know, but these guys basically spend a lot of time looking at the fragments going, is this a weird construct for the time for people to say in their grammar? Why would they do this? Is it possible that some scribe has made a mistake sometime in the fourth or fifth or sixth centuries and they're copying and they say, well, this doesn't make sense, so let me just fix it? We know that's happened in other places, and Sam Williams argues it happened in here. And again, just a reminder, the bits in square brackets are not in Sam Williams's reconstruction. It's just, that's Burton Mack trying to help us to read it the way that other Bible scholars read it. So there's a number of interesting things about this. It has the exact same structure as the one we saw before, the kerygma, the gospel. That Paul says Paul has been taught and is now the center of his teaching that he's spreading to all these churches and communities that he's creating. This, on the other hand, although he says is also something that he's preserving, this is a little different. There are a number of things missing from it. We have Jesus's death, right? There it is. God has regarded Jesus' death as a means of expiation, right? But we don't have his burial. It's just sort of implied. I mean, of course they would have buried him. That's what people would have done. But we certainly don't have him being raised. The word raised and nothing like it appears in this earlier fragment, nor do we have him appearing after his death. We only have the first half of Paul's kerygma that predates Paul. And yet, despite the fact that the raising and the appearing are missing from this, we still have the core arguments that says, in this case, his death alone is enough, because God, in the past, when Gentiles and Jews got together, God overlooked the failure to observe the Torah on the part of the Gentiles and allowed Gentiles and Jews to be together in a community. But now, with Jesus, God has decided that Jesus' death is a means of expiation because Jesus' faithfulness was to the Torah and to God was so complete that those who follow him inherit that righteousness. And that allows those who follow Jesus, even if they're Gentiles, even if they don't follow Jewish law, they are still treated as righteous and allowed to participate in these new Galilean communities. And we see that in the second half. God did this to show his righteousness. And this is the part, and to make righteous the one whose faithfulness stems from Jesus' own faithfulness. That's the recipe. That's why we can all get together now. It's why we can form these communities. And you could see why Paul would love this and quote this in Romans, because it goes to the core of his argument about us all coming together and forming our communities, eating our meals, taking care of each other, remembering, what Christ did for us and being faithful unto God. All of this is in here. And yet there's no resurrection and there's no appearance. And that's interesting. So generally, biblical scholars have decided that this is earlier than the kerygma. This is a stage of Christianity that predates the kerygma. And it might even be an earlier version of the kerygma. The kerygma that was quoted in Corinthians might have represented a later stage of development of this exact same text. Once they decided that the resurrection and the appearances were an important part of justifying the communities coming together. And what Burton Mack sees in this is he sees an explanation for why Paul is so different from the early sayings communities. Because in the early sayings communities, not only don't we have the resurrection or the appearances or the whole passion from Mark on, which none of which is anywhere to be found in Paul, we don't even have the resurrection. We don't have his appearances, and we don't even have Jesus's death. The sayings are just about, here's the stuff that Jesus said. We love this stuff. We love him for saying these things. We will remember this man. The end. Let us try to live like that. But that's all they have. They don't have death or burial or resurrection or, the appearances. So how do you get from that, Jesus is this cool teacher and we want to live like him, to the kerygma? So scholars are really excited to discover this in Romans, because this looks like the stepping stone between Jesus as a man to Jesus as a man who became a superman or was a superman originally, or at any rate has this divine cycle around his death and resurrection. Because here we've got the death, and the death alone is enough to justify the community. And then in the next stage, the resurrection is added and the appearances to justify the community. And then at some point, the seventh line of the original one is added in order to try to establish the unbroken line of apostolic succession from Jesus to Cephas and the 12, and then to the apostles, and then to the bishops. So you could sort of see layers being added to the story of Jesus over time. And somewhere at the beginning of this is, don't take the status quo for granted. Love one another. Don't treat all this like it's going to last forever, to quote Stephen's reference to the apocalyptic side of Jesus. This too shall pass. And then where will you be? You have to be good for goodness' sake, not just do whatever, the people around you do. The stuff that Martin Luther King Jr. sees as the heart of the Christian message and quotes whenever he quotes Paul is this earliest layer, especially. What is it that Jesus was trying to teach us? And when we're trying to understand how could we get from that to where we are today, we're so fortunate that we found Thomas in the Nag Hammadi jars, so that we could see that early stage of the sayings. We're so fortunate that scholars were able to find within Matthew and Luke this earlier Q saying strata to confirm what we see in Thomas. And now we're so fortunate that Paul respected these early teachings of the people who came before him so much they quoted them verbatim. And we could see what the concepts are before Paul starts his ministry. So, Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
All right, this is really exciting for me. I don't even know how to convey it because you don't seem to know the secrets but I saw this in past times because of faith/faithfulness and then faith/faithfulness and this whole language. This is code language for something in Judaism that's very, very essential, and it's something like sofer sune that needs to be unpacked, but is critical, and it is actually sofer sune. It's how you get to sofer sune, and essentially it's actually a pretty simple concept once you get a good analogy. And the analogy goes like this: that when God is creating man, man made a partnership with God made a partnership with man that we're going to be partners in creation. We're going to be in it together, and we are going to make a covenant that we're going to do it together and listen to each other. And we're going to trust each other. And if you listen to me and I listen to you, we're going to be successful. And there's this idea that man just needs to listen to God. And if you do your job, which is again in super sune language, is essentially there is a relationship with nature, the world around you, and there is essentially what it's asking of you to do. So if you have something specific to do, then you should just be looking, what is nature, what is life asking for me to do? If you do that properly, it's essentially fulfilling your role in this partnership. And again, this partnership is again having, if you look at two partners, generally what goes wrong is one loses dedication to the other. So really faith and faithfulness is a word in Hebrew called emunah, and it reflects the loyalty one has essentially to their partnership. It's essentially in the best analogy is marriage language. If you're married to someone, it's like, how into the marriage are you? And specifically, that's represented by your integrity, your loyalty to not chasing after others, and then really doing really good stuff for your partner. And so emunah in this case does not mean faith, it means faithfulness, but it also means faithfulness is embodied by having faith in your partner, even when they're gone, even when they disappear, even when they look like they're doing something not right, you still have faith in them. So this is where it is faith. And this is where Rabbi Sachs explicitly says, and it's a very Jesus-y idea, that God has more faith in us than we do in him. And it's that faithfulness that he has, it's that faith that God has in us. And this is where in Jewish language, you see this in the prayers all the time, it talks about God being faithful, God being faithful, God being faithful. What is God being faithful to? It just means God is reliable, has integrity, and is loyal to the integrity of his creations, and is essentially not going to abandon you, and is trustworthy. It's like if you're a partner or an investor, you know he's not going to pull out. And so if you have this this faith/faithfulness, it means you're loyal. And you look at someone who's really into Jesus and they're like really have a lot of faith. It's really they're actually demonstrating this aspect of loyalty and that nothing is going to shake them from this principle. And so when I see this is early covenantal language. This is very much like the Torah. That sounds very, very much more like Jewish stuff and less like Christian stuff. So I would have guessed this is one of the earliest possible sources. It's very humanizing, and it's very much also the way that like Abraham and Jacob are also still live on, is they are or more immortalized through their children. So it seems like Jesus also just gets to live on, not being actually immortal, but he's immortalized as a human being because he's sort of become more than himself, and he lives on in his followers. And the idea of him surpasses, it's almost like the virtue of Jesus is like, right? That's what lives on. That's his essential footprint that lives on, right? So, anyways, that's what I have to say on it. But this idea of faith/faithfulness is a very strong code. Like anybody who knows Jewish stuff, this is like a big red flag that this is just like the language from before. Scholars would be all over this, like you're saying. So, yeah.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. Can you type a transliteration of that Jewish word into the text?
Sure.
Just for future reference? Because we'll obviously want to come back to these issues. They're going to be recurring. I mean, Paul is going to talk about this stuff a lot, as we all know. So that's fantastic. There's if we think of this second not quite charisma that Paul's quoting here, which talks about the death but not the resurrection, and that being enough because of God's involvement. If we talk about that as being the missing link between the pre-Pauline charisma and the ancient sayings tradition of the very earliest Christians, what it almost looks like, and this is what Burton Mack talks about. He says there's a number of biblical scholars that wonder about this, about the early Christians. We always assume that Christianity started as a Jewish movement, and maybe they'd been Hellenized, maybe not, but at any rate, it was a splinter group that split off from the Jews. But a lot of scholars, says Burton Mack, actually wonder if it was the other way around. If it started out as a Diogenes-like movement, a Cynic movement, a Stoic movement that was all full of wisdom sayings, and that they were interested in the Jews and wanted to get closer to the Jews, but at first they weren't allowed to. And so they began learning more about the Jews to figure out how to do it and importing these core Jewish conceptions of faith and faithfulness, the covenant, and so on, and adding them to the basal layer of the wisdom sayings, and that everything came from there. In other words, instead of Hellenized Jews, there's plenty of evidence that suggests it could also have been the other way around. It could have been Judaized Hellenes, Judaized Greeks, and that's where Christianity came from. And the truth is probably, as we've said before, that is a lot of different strands going a lot of different directions and eventually braiding together into a whole. Thank you for that, Ari. That's Emuna. That's going to be very helpful. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is actually an important point, because I think whether you're looking at it from some of the Greek perspectives and what Christianity borrowed from the Greeks, clearly, and obviously in the later years with Thomas Aquinas, flat out using Aristotle, using Aristotle's logic with a transubstantiation. But the important thing is to kind of understand the point of Christ is that it's God incarnate. I mean, it's coming down to earth. So this idea that there is this fully divine individual that is embodying the human love, and he's coming down because he's divine. It's coming down as a way of love and service. And the reason why is it's not surprising to kind of see some of the things that Ari's been able to point out, because basically it is a covenant. But what happens in that process is that you have a covenant with a real person now. And that covenant with that real person makes it that much more tangible. It's no longer in the abstract. So when you read about something like, whatever it is, humbling himself in some way, shape, or form, whether it be washing feet or whatever it may be, that's a way of kind of saying this is even God did this, and here he came down. And so I think that part of it is kind of understanding when we're thinking about what is it that sustains communities, or enabled communities to feel like they could participate. And so, and that is essentially you're starting to see also how this power of myth comes together as well with the with the embodied Christ. So anyway, I think that, just to point that out, it's not surprising to see some of these correlations, because it is only the whole point of it is essentially that Christ is coming down because he's a person. I mean, and so there is a relationship. So the relationship and covenant with God part too is actually another important part. It's like, obviously, when you have a relationship with Christ, and this is, part of the issue is that you have a personal relationship. So it's this personal relationship that you're actually communicating directly with Christ, and who is God. And that relates, now you're relating to the human version of a personal God. And, so that's a powerful, powerful way of getting people to coordinate.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, it was a few weeks ago that I was focusing on, I initially started talking about Paul from the context of his focus on the death and the resurrection. And I will never forget Sharon putting her hand up and going, and community, right? Because he cared about the community too. And now I think about that every time I look at this stuff, and I see it over and over. This idea that central to Paul, and perhaps to this pre-Pauline Christian group that taught him, is the central part is the community, and that the purpose of the theology is to justify the community. And that's sort of the line that Burton Mark says is pretty standard among scholars who study the early sayings gospels and study this pre-Paul layer and then study Paul. Between this, we've got 20, 30 years of early Christian history here where it looks like the center was just what Sharon said. The central focus was community building and coming together into a kind of sacred covenant with each other, that we will treat one another kindly, and that as a community we will also treat the stranger kindly. That this is we're a community that is trying to have a kind of solidarity that the Roman Empire and the Alexandrian empires before have really shattered. They've left everybody adrift and disconnected and atomized, and we just can't live like that. And we need to make a new world. And that revolutionary idea that, we don't have, if this state of affairs under the Roman Empire is not satisfactory, if we can't live like this, we don't have to wait for an apocalypse someday to bring about a change. We can contribute to the apocalypse taking place now. We don't know exactly when it's done, but we can start the work right now. We can form the kingdom of God right now in how we treat one another. And just in that act of forming the community that behaves in a certain way, we have changed the world. And as we draw in more people, that change spreads. And that is the apocalypse rolling out and replacing the old rotten world with a new world based on faithfulness to one another and to God. So you can sort of see how this coheres as a message in these three early decades of Christianity, and maybe even in Jesus's own time. Maybe Jesus himself is saying these things from what we can reconstruct. So there's a couple of last things to say before we wrap up. And the first is from Galatians, just a little quote, which comes really to the core of Paul's message, and again comes to the core of what Sharon said about Paul that I'm always thinking about. Paul says, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. This is that use of theology to justify community building in a nutshell. And that brotherhood of man concept of Christianity is baked right in here. And you see it from Paul's time all the way through to Martin Luther King and his message, which hits Paul over and over and over, hits this theme over and over and over, that what is the core of the message. But what's excluded from this, according to Burton Mack, is really interesting. He says, Mark changes the focus from the kerygma and the community to the passion. What were the events leading up to, Jesus's death? What happened, moment by moment, what happened? And that's when you start really getting into the details of the crucifixion, the details of the accusations, the details of who betrayed whom. All of that comes in with Mark. Paul has very little interest in it. And these pre-Pauline layers seem to have very little interest in it. They don't talk about Jesus' death at all before these two fragments that Paul has quoted. We go back to the sayings, and they have nothing to say about Jesus' death. And the only reference to the cross in the sayings that we have is there's one saying in Q about carrying your own cross. And, our reading is, post-gospel. We point it and go, see, they did know about the cross. Except the problem is carrying your own cross is a figure of speech that goes back to Stoic and Cynic traditions. And it's from Diogenes. It's not about being crucified. It's about, you got to be willing to suffer for the truth and for doing the right thing. And the fact that, later that becomes literally the cross with Jesus doesn't mean that that's what the Q community meant by it. Considering that all the rest of the Q sayings look exactly like something Diogenes might say, that probably meant the older reference to carrying your own cross and not the later reference to being crucified by the cross. Otherwise, they would have had more to say about Jesus's death and what happened. And they don't. They just aren't interested in it. They don't talk about it. So the point that Burton Mack makes about these fragments is that it's Mark, as far as we can tell, who first introduces the passion, the whole story, the betrayal and everything. And what's interesting about the passion is that the passion story is a betrayal of Paul's kerygma. Because the kerygma and the Q sayings are all focused on a community that includes potentially the whole world. It's about, and now I'm going back to Stephen's questions from our very first year, centripetal versus centrifugal. The interest for these first 30 years of Christianity are entirely centripetal. How do we come together? How do we justify coming together? How do we be faithful with one another? How do we make sure everybody is welcome? That's the focus. But once you introduce the passion, the focus shifts to who's to blame. Whose fault is it that Jesus died? And what are we going to do about it? The seeds of anti-Semitism that are going to become a plague throughout the medieval era, they aren't sown in the first 30 years. In the first 30 years, we have Judaized Greeks. We have Greek clubs forming around Jewish synagogues and wanting, they're pro-Jewish. They're you guys are doing cool things. We want to join. We want to come together. That's the relationship to Judaism we see all the way through Paul. Even Paul's saying, yeah, we can all be part of the same community. And that's the whole point of this thing, is our covenant of faithfulness with one another, as well as with God. And there's no place in that for, you did it. No, it's their fault. Who killed him? And how are we going to punish him? It literally excludes any possible interest in that. So we shouldn't be surprised that nobody's talking about it for the first 30 years. It's just not their area of interest. And it's telling that Mark, who first brings it up, is writing after the smashing of the second temple system in Judea by the Romans, which is a horrible cataclysm that shocks the whole world. I mean, everybody talks about it. In the far reaches of the empire, they're talking about it. I mean, but the Jews and the Christians especially are devastated by this massive transformation. Everybody who's writing a gospel or a letter or anything else after that happens, or while it's happening, has an entirely different perspective on life, the universe, and everything than these first 30 years of Christianity. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I just have a quick question. The concept of city-states, you talked about that at length, and the city-states had social, political, economic, and religious power, right? Yes. Well, how was this concept how did it figure into the establishment of the early Christian church under Paul? How did those two things interdigitate? Because one was more the establishment of a kind of a hierarchy, right? And I'm not sure. I'm trying to link the two together in my mind. So that's my question.
God, that's a fantastic question, Sharon. You know, it's going to take some time to answer, but the short version is we have to remember that the kind of city state that exists in Paul's time is the debased, broken city state that Alexander put in place when he spread it as a tool of conquest. It's not the earlier Athenian, Spartan, Corinthian form of city state where it was people coming together as separate tribes and braiding themselves into one people and governing themselves. That was a very different construct than what we see at this time. What we see at this time is the city state used as a rule of rulership. It's a system of rulership in which it's imposed on you from above, and you don't really have a say. You might be invited to trade and to labor, but you're not going to be invited to vote. And your group, if you form a Christian community or whatever these communities called themselves, you form these kind of cosmopolitan, covenants. If these were real city states of the Athenian era, then that movement would have been one of the tribes that sat on the council of the polis and had a say in governance. But instead, what we find in Roman times is any movement like that that arises is excluded from governance. And so what we have here is a countercultural movement. And it's really demanded by the times. This is Burton Mack's point, is that the times are excluding almost everybody from governance. They're subjects, not citizens. And that's just not going to fly. The rulers can't possibly know in detail what their subjects need, what the actual conditions are on the ground in every different lake, in every different, farm, in every different forest. But the people who live there do, which is why they should have a say in their own governance. So the exclusion of all these people and the domination of them leads to poor governance. A lot of decisions are made by people who don't know what's going on. And it's just day by day, week by week, it aggravates everybody. So everybody's involved in this utopian project of trying to come up with an alternative to the Roman Empire. And they know they can't break away militarily because nobody can beat the Romans. But they have to figure out how can we make a new way of life, but do it somehow inside of this dead shell that will hurt us if we try to cast off the shell. And this idea of a house church, the house church movement, we'll just get together for meals and we're just visiting. That's not illegal, right? We're just having conversations. That's not illegal. The fact that they're about God and our covenant and faithfulness to each other and trying to do the right thing, that's nobody's business but ours. So it is the movement to create an alternative religious political economy inside of the dead shell of the Roman Empire. That's how they interdigitate at first. Certainly for the first 30 years, that's what's happening. But we will come back. I mean, it's such a great question. We're going to come back to it probably every week for the rest of this year. It's the dominant theme that shapes the course of changing this religion from where we see it today in this discussion that we're having to where it ends up when it becomes approved by Constantine and becomes a religious empire. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
No, I think actually, Sharon pretty much covered her question captured a lot of what I was, thinking about. I mean, I think it's a really important point too that you hit when you said how it goes from this idea, who to blame for Christ's death, as opposed to actually following in Christ's footsteps. Like, it's such a difference is that, it turns into kind of who can we scapegoat based off of Christianity versus thinking about the fact that technically he's giving up his life for everybody else technically, and that you're supposed to be following the acts, not being the one that persecutes everyone else or looking for somebody to scapegoat in that particular instance. Martin Luther actually had written quite a bit that I think often gets overlooked. That obviously blame Jewish people for not following the way he saw the world, which is really problematic. But maybe just a general question, really quickly, is like, what is that? The fact that over time, repeatedly, that human beings have taken this story, and taken the worst from it. What does that tell you, really? What does that tell you about human nature? I mean, I wouldn't mind actually getting your overall opinion on that.
Well, I'm not going to try to tackle that one today.
Okay, I'm
But I
sorry to
won't
do that
forget.
to you. I'm sorry to do that to you because it's not the yeah.
I won't forget. It's going to come up over and over and over, right? Because what's going to happen is as we go from early Christian thinker to early Christian thinker and work our way into the medieval period, that the question that you just asked is going to come up with every one of them. What did they take from this and why? And what we're going to see is that although in hindsight, we're taught that the Middle Ages are a dark age. They're a time of ignorance and violence and superstition, and they're just awful, and nothing good happened. And that makes it easy for us to conclude, that it's human nature to take to listen to this message of love and come away, thinking, oh, he told me to hate, I'm going to go hate in the world. But as we go through the Middle Ages, what we're going to find is an enormous number of thinkers who do take Jesus's message to heart, and they do write it down and say it, and they're normally neglected. When we skip the Middle Ages and we just go back to the classical period and then jump ahead to the modern, we're not just skipping, horrible things that people did, but we're skipping some amazing thinkers and writers who did beautiful work in this area. And we're going to fix that this year. We're going to cover those.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to make it a binary.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, it's just it does obviously exist on a spectrum, but
Yeah.
it has served as a tool.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if I had to generalize, I'd say, we can take away from this to err is human and communication is really hard. It's
That's it. Yeah, that's it.
it's like, you see,
yeah.
you see those internet memes going around where Jesus
That-
says, love one another. And they're like, even Joe, he's like, what, did I stutter? Love everybody. Don't pick on Joe. What is wrong with you? It's very hard to communicate.
Exactly.
You'd think that it's easy, but no.
That's awesome. Oh yeah, thank you for that. I so needed that today.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Thanks, Joe. John, hey, welcome to the call. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, Rick. My question is regarding the original Christian communities and then the later gospel communities. Did the original communities get upset when they found out about the gospel message because it kind of changed their beliefs and their messages and what they were kind of believing in?
What a good question. I don't know if you're planning to come on subsequent weeks, but we are going to trace that very question week by week because we're going to, this first century of Christianity, I'm spending more time on than the later centuries. Each later century will get some time, but not as much because there's a period of rapid change in people's understanding of Christianity. And a lot of it happens right at that point of the ending of this Second Temple period, the smashing of the Jewish state. But we don't have all the evidence we need to fully answer your question, but we have fragments that suggest some things. And one of the things is there are 3 different layers to Q. And we know that's the same community working over time. And the 3rd layer appears to be the layer that's informed by the coming war with the Romans, or maybe it's contemporary with the war with the Romans. And the Q community themselves change. They get bitter and angry at that point. And why wouldn't you? I mean, the Romans just came in and smashed the temple. You could be a love and hope and faith guy to the max, turned up to 11, but somebody comes in and smashes everything. In the immediate aftermath of that, it's going to take you a beat to get back to the original message. For a while, you're going to be like, this sucks. This is terrible. And so we see a wave of this sucks coming from all the communities right around 65, 70, 80, right in that time frame. as they see the iron fist approaching, as the violence is done, and as they look upon the ruins. A lot of negativity springs up in a lot of these communities. But your question is still legit, because some of them did, after their initial anger and grief, decide to go back to their earlier focus on community and love. And what we see happening, and it's fortunate the way that the evidence is laid out for us. What we see happening starting in 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, in this period, we start to have more and more writings survive. And some of those writings are different communities writing about their opinions about the other communities. And so some of what you're asking about is actually documented. It's still nothing like giving us what we'd like to see, which is a complete accounting of what are the different strands of Christianity and how did they all develop over time. But we're seeing pieces of it. Around, before the smashing of the temple, these communities might have disagreed with each other or argued with each other, like we see Paul do in the letters, but they didn't attack each other, as far as we can tell. They just had disagreements, and sometimes they didn't even know each other. But after the smashing of the temple, and the focus begins to change, and especially after Marcion in the 110, 120 time frame starts deciding that there ought to be a canon, we ought to distinguish the legitimate writings from the illegitimate writings. After that point, people really start to go after each other. The different Christian denominations start to get concerned with who's right and who's wrong, which group has the authentic message and which one has a corrupted message, who's in and who's out. Then we have a lot of writing about what you're asking about. Many people are talking about how they feel about the other groups. And we're going to get into all that. It's a very interesting period. But I can't do justice to it in the time we have remaining today. There's only 29 minutes, so that's my sort of sketch.
Thank you.
But it's a great question, John. I hope you come back and we'll explore it together week by week. With this, I finished our walkthrough of early Christian stuff for today, and I'd like to take us back to Kenneth Smith, and we'll go to chapter 9, paragraph 3, and start working through the text, informed by what we've just been talking about. Because, of course, what he's talking about is he's generalizing about medieval Christianity, and especially the dominant form that rises to power as a religious empire. We can now read it with the larger context. So it starts, I think we actually did paragraph 3 last time at the end of the session, but it went too fast. We were sort of rushing for time. So I'm going to slow down because there's interesting things to chew on in here. And then it leads into paragraphs 4 and 5 in a beautiful way. So he starts with this: what is hard for Christians no less than for moderns, and he might as well have capitalized moderns because he means all people in the modern epoch. For Christians no less than for moderns in general to comprehend is the extent of the artificialism that dominates their inner lives. Now, I don't know why I read past this last time, because boy, is that some juicy Kenneth Smith talk right there. There is a lot of stuff to deal with here. So first of all, if any, keyword time, right? Anytime Kenneth Smith talks about ancients or medievals or moderns, he's talking about this Hegelian existentialist model of history, that there are these zeitgeists that are born within the decadence of the old epoch, and they challenge the old epoch exactly where it's weak, and they put their finger on the pulse of why everybody hates the old order, and they offer a new interpretation of the world and humanity and God and nature that people find new life in, as an escape from the old way of life. This is part of the Hegelian model. And so it rises to power and the old system dies, but it goes through its own arc, and eventually it becomes corrupt and has to be replaced by some new subsequent model. And this is an oversimplification, but this is where the concepts of the ancient world, the medieval world, and the modern world come from in Hegelianism. And this is what Kenneth is alluding to when he talks about moderns. All of us living today are moderns. And we're not postmoderns. That's a term from aesthetics or literature or what have you. In the Hegelian system, we're all still moderns, and we will be until the modern epoch is gone. And so when he says Christians no less than moderns, he's not saying that Christians aren't moderns. That he's definitely not saying that. He's not saying, and that's important for people who still, if you haven't really soaked in Kenneth, you might think take modern the way that moderns take modern, which is that it's praise. Why would you want to be anything other than modern? Everybody else is obsolete. What are you saying? I'm obsolete? It sounds like an accusation to contrast Christians and moderns, but that's not what he means, because he doesn't see being modern as a point of pride or flattery. It's just another epoch, and it has its own blind spots and its own evils, just like all of the epochs do. And it should be criticized for the things it does wrong, even though it hates to be criticized. It should be, and moderns should learn to do that work, to do self-criticism. So that's how he means the juxtaposition of moderns. He's not saying Christians aren't modern. He's saying these are two different dimensions of ways to look at groups of people. Modern Christians would be a subset of Christians, not an alternative to Christians. He's talking about Christianity as it developed from the early stage into the medieval stage, especially, and then what it has turned into in the modern world. And so, whether you're a Christian or not, it's hard for moderns to understand how much of what we take for our inner, true, natural self is not natural at all. There's a lot of quotes that Kenneth likes around this particular topic to go to, and one of them is Oscar Wilde. Most people are other people. They're not who they think they are. A lot of what they think is their most private inner self is just an imitation of somebody else. It's a performance. They don't even know they're performing. There's a story that says, when the audience at the end of an opera or great play leaps to their feet and cheers and applauds for all their might, and the people on the stage bow, on the one hand, they're bowing in gratitude for the applause. But on the other hand, the secret line within theater is that they're bowing to the superior actors in the audience, because the people on stage know that they're just doing a temporary performance, whereas the people performing in the audience actually believe they are those roles, even though they're not. And that it is the audience who's giving the performance of their lives. It's what Shakespeare says, all the world's a stage, and we think he's just being poetic. He's saying, no, really, Homo sapiens doesn't know what it is. As a species, we throw ourselves into roles and we believe we are those people, but who are we to know who the hell we're capable of being? We are full of potential that is invisible to us. We don't know ourselves. And this is why the Greeks say gnothi seauton, the first rule. You want to talk to the oracle at Delphi? First go home and figure out who the hell you are. How are you going to understand anything I have to say to you if you don't even know who or what you are? You need to figure that out. That's where we start. It's the beginning of wisdom. Anything that the oracle has to add is just filigree details, footnotes on what you're going to learn by searching yourself. So he's saying here, and this is foreshadowing of the last third of the book, he's saying that to be modern is to really profoundly not know what you are, even more than the ancients, even more than the medievals, certainly more than indigenous peoples. Moderns don't know what they are because they think what they are is natural. It's natural to be this way. And it's good. It's better. It's superior. We're the advanced form. Everybody else is obsolete. Basic. These are assumptions taken for granted in the word modern. And what he's saying is he's challenging us directly for one of the first times and saying, deep in your innermost secrets of your heart, where you think you are most truly free, an enormous amount of what's in there came from other people in other places. And especially in the modern world, a lot of it came from propaganda. A lot of it came from the news. A lot of it came from Hollywood. A lot of it came from indoctrination during, elementary school or college. A lot of it came from the culture pushed on you and your corporations you worked for. He says, and you don't know. To be modern is to not even suspect the extent of the artificiality that's inside of us. And it's why moderns are so gullible about the market and about demagogues, because we think what could be better than people giving us what we want. But the criticism that's inherent in this sentence is saying, how do you even know that you want it? The fact that it's in there with its little siren song, that could be just an addiction that has been cultivated in you that's bad for you. It might not be sophrosune at all. You might be yearning for the thing that's going to make you sicker. It's not your inner instincts calling out for life. It could be a little bit of programming nudging you towards death and illness, as happens when people join a totalitarian cult, right? That yearning that's in them gets twisted into a desire for nihilism and destruction, serving the dear leader. But they think that's their innermost true self. They don't understand how they've been broken and discarded by the economy to put them into such a state of rage that they really just want to put a brick through a window, and they'll follow any big monkey who offers to do it for them and to give them permission to do it in turn. They don't know what is their innermost character. They don't know what's natural, what's I'm gonna use the word that Stephen says I have to pay a penny for. So here's my penny, ka-chink. To use the Aristotelian phrase, they don't know what's essential about their character. They mistake contingencies, things that just happen to have been put into them, for parts that are the most truly personal part of themselves, and they can't tell the difference. And as Kenneth says, that stuff isn't just a foul spice that's been added to what would be a healthy food. They say he's saying moderns are artificialized more than anybody ever has been in the history of the world. And the way we know that is nobody before ever had a science or an industry for manipulating people the way we do. They did their best, but we now have an industrialized civilization that is really good at inserting artificial desires into human beings and making us want things we don't want. I mean, deodorant commercials. The pretty girl approaches the man, but then turns away. Oh my God, what is that odor? And the guy goes, oh no. And the crestfallen look on his face. And now you're crestfallen. Oh no, that girl I like, is she secretly thinking I stink? Maybe she won't return my calls because I didn't buy the right brand of deodorant. I mean, these guys are masters of this stuff. They make their career doing this. I don't know if you guys have watched the TV series Mad Men. It's all about the culture of people who spend their whole lives learning how to manipulate other people and convince other people to believe things that aren't good for them. To be a modern, and this is his preview of the final third of the book, is to be the most artificial kind of human being that has ever existed, on the one hand. And on the other hand, to have no idea that that's true at all. To believe with all your heart that all the fake stuff inside you is the real stuff. And to not know there is fake stuff in there. When people, and I'm going to call on Ari in just a second, but I'm going to wrap up this sentence with this bit. When people say, and some beautiful people have said this under beautiful circumstances, I don't mean in any way to denigrate it, but I'm going to get philosophical with it. When people say, no matter how bad things are around you, at least inside your head, you can be free. This existentialist critique says, you can only be free inside your head if you've done the work to free yourself from the artificialities that have been growing inside your head your entire life, that were put there by people who did not have your best interests at heart. If you haven't done that work, you're not free inside your head. And there's so much artificiality we're marinating in that none of us will ever be fully free in our head, no matter how much work we do. It's like being an alcoholic addict. The work of learning, the grip that alcohol has upon an alcoholic never ends until the day you die. That's when you're done. So the existentialist philosophical critique of what it means to be modern is, like an alcoholic addict who's determined not to go back into the bottle, you have to be watching yourself. Why do I want this? Where did that impulse come from? Why am I persuaded by this thing, but not by that thing? That's got to be an ongoing conversation you have with yourself for the rest of your life. Like Heraclitus says, you couldn't find the limits of your soul even if you spent the rest of your life searching. That's what he says. You've got to search yourself. Long before he had the faintest clue modernity was ever going to arise, he gives us the core piece of advice to go with what Kenneth is saying here. We have a duty to search ourselves for the rest of our lives, looking for and uprooting the artificialisms to try to clear space for whatever might be healthy in us to have a chance to grow. We've got to get all that poison out of us. And we'll be at it for the rest of our lives. Like a gardener never stops weeding. Weeding is just part of gardening forever. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I had some interesting ideas on this. It's really cool. Something along the lines of how the modern age is probably, we're saying the same thing in different language, is in a state of cognitive dissonance more than any other era. And it's, I think, again, I like to systematize things, which itself might be a false modern era trap. Um, but I think at the same time, Aristotle would say the same thing. There's things that are more upstream and downstream that are easy to at least recognize relative to each other. You can have some causality versus symptomology versus absolute, right? You can see that this precedes. So in terms of trying to try and weight priorities, this is just trying to develop some sophrosune. Um, but I was thinking that one of the primary things that's going on here is the difference between believing we're free and behaving like we're slaves. It's I'm not sure if there's something more fundamental to being man than, or at least a modern man, but man in general versus an animal. I would say most cultures generally say things like free will and intelligence being the same sort of the embodiment of free will. It's like because I have an intelligence and rationality, I can have free will, which that doesn't necessarily jive. But if you want to reduce it to that, you're still at least coming to this conclusion that there's something in there making decisions, thinking and doing things, being agentic. There is agency versus contingency. It's not all contingency. It's not all determined. And to me, this is really the strange thing. That's also a lot of people I talk to who think about this a little too much get to this idea that all of the modern scientific approaches to explaining the universe or reality come to this almost deterministic aspect that free will must be an illusion and it can't exist. Yet in our decision making philosophies of like life and running businesses and politics, and every game theory always acts as if there's agents involved. And they often just say, oh, it makes the math makes better sense if you just pretend we're agents. It's much easier that way. And to me, this is also, if you're using something like Occam's razor here, that's a lot of mental gymnastics for saying, because we all feel like we actually have free will and the system looks like it has people that have free will, it's better to just assume the ontology is actually free will and your epistemology is wrong, right? Right? Your epistemology, but they can't throw away their epistemology. But no, but again, this idea, and I think that's at the heart of this, that again, there's this major confusion literally by looking into the world and seeing things like slavery and freedom, and then identifying them in yourself as the complete opposite. It's really, really at the core of, I think, what a lot of people break down. And we talked about this before. It also seems to reflect the ability to language to be breaking down, because it seems like the language allows you to get yourself in circles where if you just had some really specific language that was relative to a mythology or something like a specific polis, something much more structured and less circular, like English, just the big mishmash, I think it might be harder to get into this escapism trap that this what Alistair McIntyre called like emotivism, where I can feel it, therefore it's real, and therefore my story is real because I make it real. This kind of also this postmodernist stuff. I really find it interesting, this paradox between individuals and groups and freedom and slavery. And I want to tell you a little. It's maybe less than 100 words. Something I wrote this week that I want to include in something. It's called the paradox of the individual, and it's a little bit of a parable, and it's a little bit of noesis and a little bit of gnosis. It's a little mythology, a little logos. Okay, so it starts with God saying to whoever, to a group. You'll probably recognize this from the life of Brian. It goes, God, you are all individuals. And then man as a group saying back to him, saying back to God, we are all individuals. And then an individual says, I'm not. And I specifically say, most of us believe ourselves individuals, and I. In fact, negating the self is necessary to make this statement true. Being a we is prerequisite for the I. Simultaneously, being an I is prerequisite for the we. Again, we see God demonstrating the principle of creation through the paradox of life. That which creates also, or that which brings into being also opposes that existence. Like, it's a really weird idea that God both creates you and then opposes your own creation. You're like, yeah, thanks, dude. But I think it's like this idea that you find in nature and in physics and other things, that essentially nothing comes into existence without some sort of friction.
That's right. If the butterfly wants to come out of the caterpillar, first it has to go into the chrysalis, which is the opposite. Why am I enclosing myself when I want to be free? Well, it's the only way forward, man. I don't know what to tell you. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's beautiful. Thank you, Ari. Yeah, this is some chewy stuff here. Kenneth is I think from here, through chapter 8, he's really been focusing on the ancient versus medieval as a way to understand medieval. And at times he'll talk about the moderns because he's Kenneth and he sort of can't resist. Even if it's not on subject, sometimes Kenneth will veer off into a tangent about goddamn moderns. But now we're entering the half of the medieval section that's going to talk more from time to time about moderns. And when it does, it's going to be sentences like this one that are very hard. They're talking about some of the hardest things there are. And they're hard because they directly challenge the things we love the most about our self-image, but that are therefore the most false. Because we loved them, we protected them instead of challenging them. So we never found out if they were true or not. We just assumed they were true. And the result is that's where most of our errors lie. Now, how free can you be if most of what's in you has been constructed by other people for their own purposes, to make you a good worker, to make you a resource to be exploited, to make you a tool to be wielded? If you're a hammer and other people pick you up and use you to hurt third parties, are you free? Is the hammer free when it's being wielded? These are hard questions, and we really don't like them as moderns. We're taught we have a birthright of freedom. We're not supposed to have to work for freedom. We're born that way. I find, for example, Harriet Tubman's stories of liberating slaves and what was involved in doing it is just a brilliant area to explore these problems. And she talks about how some slaves are delighted to go. Thank God you've shown up. Let's go. But sometimes even the people who say that, 1 or 2 days away from the plantation, they start to panic at night and they want to turn around and go back. And they say, it's okay. I won't tell anybody about you or what you did or the route we took. Just let me go back. And she'll draw her gun on them, which she carries for this very purpose, because she knows some of them have been slaves so long that the slavery has gotten into their head. And now they think in terms of the fear of the master. And that fear is so strong that it can overwhelm their yearning for freedom. But if she can get them over that point and make it if they need to be mastered, then for their own good, instead of allowing the master to master them, she will master them long enough to get them away from the master. And once they're out of his grip, she can let them go. And now they can discover the inner yearning for freedom that they couldn't be true to so long as this artificialism had been cultivated in them, making them afraid like a slave. And in this, there are fascinating, I mean, and these are true stories, right? She's telling, these aren't fables. These are absolutely true stories from her life. And in this, we are seeing things about freedom and individuation and development that are quite difficult for us. Sorry, John, come up here. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so relating to like breaking the hold of modernity, how do you really do that? Because isn't a big part of modernity like this idea of, I'm going to spend a couple hours a week to work on myself and I'll do some introspection. Maybe I'll hike up to Mount Everest or something and evaluate my life or whatever it is. So like part of that built into modernity is this idea of kind of like doing introspection and challenging modernity.
Well, that's a good question. there are, as Heraclitus makes clear in our section on the ancient worldview, anytime you get to the deep things of life, the universe, and everything, God, nature, and man, you are just walking on paradoxes. It's paradoxes everywhere. What is like Ari was saying, to be individual is a prerequisite to be part of a group, but to be part of a group as a prerequisite to become an individual. These are like, how could they both be true at once? We've got paradoxical dialectics all around. So what does it mean to be a modern is something that we're going to explore over time, what it means. But a big part of it is that what he's saying in this sentence, and he's not saying this is the sum total of what it means to be modern, but he's saying this first piece of understanding modernity from an existentialist perspective is to understand that people in previous epochs, even the medieval epoch, where you'd say, well, the church had this enormous sway over Europe, but nevertheless, nobody before the modern era ever had a science or an industry for cultivating human beings. They might have an art and they might try to do it like the Athenians and the Spartans. Other Greeks tried to cultivate, it was called anthropoculture. They tried to cultivate what they considered to be good human beings, but they had no industry. They had no industrial mechanisms for doing it. The being being immersed 24/7 in the internet, television, radio, movies, newspapers. We have so many mechanisms to feed the culture's preconceptions into our heads, whether we like it or not. And by the time we first think to ask a philosophical question, we've already gone through 12 years of schooling, right? Aside from what our parents did and what our church did and what our neighbors did, literally we were pouring modernity into our heads. And nobody did that before. I mean, there wasn't universal education like that among the Greeks. There wasn't in medieval France. I mean, just most people before the modern era grew up, we might say semi-feral, but Aristotle might say semi-natural, certainly less cultivated. And so those people were closer to whoever they would have become than we are. The interventions into our growth and the pruning and the pulling of our branches one way or another begins almost from day one, and it never stops. And that's never happened to people before. And so it means that what you're talking about, John, although it might be our duty and our obligation to do it, it's like David is saying in the chats, it's very difficult for most people to even want it. Why would I want to do that when I can, go to the movies, or, I can get together with my friends and yell about, Greenland or the Democrats or the Republicans. There's all these externalities that can draw us out. And most people let themselves be absorbed by those externalities. So to cultivate yourself in the way you're talking about, it's not that it's impossible to do now, but just it's hard for us. We have difficulties nobody faced before. And it goes against the flow of the zeitgeist. It can be done, but it's not unlike pushing a boulder up a hill.
Yeah, thank you. That gives me an idea, or maybe you kind of were implicitly stating this, that, just cut out the stuff you know is manipulating you.
Yes.
That's a start.
That's step one, right? It's like, I may never be a perfect, Donald and I are both programmers. I may never be a perfect programmer despite having done this for 41 years. But if I work at it, I can at least be a better programmer tomorrow than I was yesterday. And that's what we can hope for, right? As mortals, we just move the ball down the field, do a little more, pull up some artificialism out of our head. And even if there's other stuff there, I'm still better off than I was yesterday. It's just like you're saying, John. And that can become part of the recipe for philosophy going forward. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I was having another one of my funny observations. You think about World War II, and we had the rise of fascism. Of course, people overlook that fascism was actually a reaction to the Red Terror. The Europeans were terrified by what had gone on in Leninist Russia, and so the fascists rose as a reaction. And of course, they became a problem themselves. But you still had the democratic parts of Europe. You still had, the the holding the light of civilization on the hill. You know, you had Great Britain, you had France, you had Hollands. Of course, the curious and interesting thing about all these wonderful democracies, and to this day you believe in wonderful democracy, is that they could afford their wonderful democracy. I mean, it's truly a terror today. You know, you look through YouTube, America, that glorious democracy, and they're all screaming at each other. And I can't figure out why, because America still materially is a place of good supply. You know, if you want to have a tough life, go and live in some part of some ghetto in South Africa somewhere. Then you know what a tough life is. In America, they've decided things are tough when they're having the best of the world. But you look at all these wonderful democracies, and then you realise that most of them had huge colonies and empires. They were democratic back home, but dictatorial to, you know, multitudes of people that were supporting that light on the hill in the West. Of course, the problem now is that for a while, well, you know, America, Europe was a great power. America was a great power. And by the time of Ronald Reagan, though, America was in a bit of a decline, but he opened up the markets to Asia, and Asia became the growth market. But of course, now that's been rejected, and that sort of source of wealth isn't so powerful anymore. But isn't it funny that all these wonderful democracies in this democratic period was built on the subjugation of much of the world, working as the servants, the 10 servants that would support that one democratic person living in the West? Never thought of that before. Yeah, I was thinking now about the British Empire, you know, why the British Empire fell. Well, part of it was those colonies turned around to Britain and said, well, what about all this liberty and democratic ideals you've got? And the British were dumb. You know, as Nietzsche would say, their own truth destroyed them. Whereas they should have just turned around and said, oh, what? That's it for democracy. Send out the troops and shoot first and ask questions later. But they didn't do that. Maybe they had good reason, or it was beyond them. But this is it. You think of it, you suddenly realise that these glorious Western society, I think, you know, wouldn't it have been wonderful to live in the 19th century when there weren't too many major wars and you just had decades of peace, you know, and you might hop over the channel and go and visit a French art exhibit without somebody throwing bombs at you. The 19th century looks spectacular, but this sort of edifice of Western culture in the 19th century was built on the servitude and colonisation of much of the world. So that's where you got your democracy from. That's where the price was paid for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, what you're talking about is my current reading project. I'm reading for the first time. I mean, I've read fragments, but this is my first time reading cover to cover Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. Any of you can, there's the link. It's available for free from the Internet Archive. And I'll tell you that I am enjoying it so much. I'm starting to understand in more depth the things that Stephen was just talking about. And thank you, Stephen, for bringing them up. I basically feel like the title is a misnomer. It's not just the origins of totalitarianism. It's the origins of the modern nation state, modern markets. It's the origins of anti-Semitism. It's the origins of racism. It's the origins of fascism. It's the origins of communism. It's the origins of socialism. And it's the origins of totalitarianism, because you can't understand the latter without understanding all of the former, as she demonstrates. And she walks through history that I've heard references to, but never really understood before. I think it's one of the most important books I've ever read, and it's highly recommended by Kenneth Smith, which is why Donald just gave his thumbs up when I mentioned it. Sharon, you wanted to add something on this?
Yes, because the New York Times 2 weeks ago, the book review had an article, a whole center spread on Hannah Arendt. And I just tell you what the preamble is. It says, 50 years after her death, the German-born political thinker has been enshrined as a prophet for our times. What did she actually say?
Yes.
And so I read the whole center spread and I found a couple of interesting things about her. First of all, I didn't know that she was at one time married to Heidegger, right? So that was an interesting physiological curve. And then she was married to a communist. That's another philosophical curve. But if you can look it up online, it was very interesting, probably because I know nothing about her.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, she's an interesting figure. And
Yes.
everything she writes about in this book describes what's happening right now in the United States. Not just by one political party. It describes what we're all doing. I mean, it
Yes.
is really uncanny. Democrats, Republicans, independents, other countries, you name it, everybody's reaction to the things that have been happening are all right here in this book. And
What's the
she
name
gives
of the book?
the origins of totalitarianism.
Oh, yes.
And it is fantastic. If you've never read Hannah Arendt before, the thing to know about her is that she's not a demagogue. She doesn't write like Nietzsche at all. And she's also not an obscurantist. She doesn't write like Hegel, where you really have to struggle to piece out the sentences and what's being said. She writes in a clear, calm, straightforward way that summarizes enormous amounts of research, like Kenneth does, and pulls together history by enormous numbers of historians and boils it down to okay, another penny in the jar, the essentials of kind of what are the big thrusts of 18th, 19th, 20th century history. It is the most illuminating thing about the modern world I've ever read in my life. And let me tell you, I've read a lot about the modern world, but she makes me feel like I knew nothing.
That is a bold statement, Rick. The most? Are you kidding me?
Yeah, I would have told you a month ago that Eichmann in Jerusalem was somewhere in my top 3 or 4, but I'm like, this book displaces everything. This is just so fascinating. I feel like there's all kinds of things that have been happening around me all my life, and I've looked right at them and I've assumed they were something other than what they were. And now I'm starting to see them clearly. She's very good.
I know I'm a one-trick pony, but did any of you read Morality by Jonathan Sachs yet? I felt that same exact statement reading that book, and I've read a lot of stuff. And this is the thing he wrote before he died, and it's the culmination of his life's work. And for all of us who like it, it's very much based on the foundations of Alistair MacIntyre in After Virtue.
I will
So
read this next after I
it's
finish the
you're gonna
origins of
love it.
totalitarianism.
If you are at all interested in audiobooks, he reads it himself,
Sweet.
and it's lovely to hear his British voice because that's really why he's how I got sold on him is his British auditorial like man, that man could give a speech. Whew. Okay, so yeah.
Nice.
That,
Thanks. I'll
all
read
right,
it.
that's it.
So can I just add a quick editorial to what you're saying, Rick? Because in this article, it says, but it was the election of Donald Trump in 2016 that enshrined her as a prophet. Bewildered Americans looked to her work about the European cataclysm for guidance. Sales of Arendt's The Origins of Totalism soared. No small feat for the 600-page treatise on racism and imperialism that led to the atrocities of Nazism and Stalinism.
Yes. Yes.
I guess that summarizes what you're saying.
Yeah. She changes my understanding of what a nation even is, which
Yes.
is no small feat. Anyway, I'll mention her again. She's going to come up because when we get to the modern epoch, we're going to be talking a lot about Hannah
I
Arendt.
saw her and I saved this and I said, yes, they keep talking about her. Let me read it. It was a very, very enlightening piece.
She's quite good. You would think that totalitarianism would be a depressing subject to read about. And it was the same with Eichmann in Jerusalem. You're like, oh my God, why do I want to read that? I'm just going to be depressed the whole time. But no, she writes in a calm, clear fashion. She just like sheds light on things that you go, my God, why couldn't anybody say it like this before? Suddenly I feel like I see what's happening.
600 pages of it, I guess.
Yeah, it takes time, but
Yes.
it's
Yes.
not a chore. It's not a
Yeah.
chore. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oops. There we go.
Well, okay. One, I'm a big fan of Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. And it is in totalitarianism, her clear explanation of what totalitarianism is. When Hegel talks a lot about civil society. Totalitarianism is the destruction of civil society. That there are no societal institutions, no groupings, no associations of citizens that are not government institutions. That the government has total power. That's why they're called totalitarian. And she pulls this out of not how, like a lot of people like to do, how was Stalin different from Hitler, or who was really socialist, or who was communist, or who was this. She finds from all these modern political strains that they all seek forms of government that kill or suppress civil society to give, to atomize the population. They give them no associations where they can be any counterbalance, or it's something. It's not like, well, free men could govern themselves. Nonsense. I'll govern you for you, and I'll make sure you don't ever get together with other free men. But the real reason I raised my hand was I wanted to know from Stephen if he wants that penny in the jar because he finds some incongruity or irony or tension between this existential philosophy, always finding essentials, essences, everywhere it looks. Is that what he...
And there's a product of rationalism. Rationalism believes that there's a huge essential network,
well,
behind reality, and it was Schelling that warns, not quite.
So
there is something in existence that precedes the essence. So you can create all the essential...
Well, non-existent beings don't discover essences. They don't discover anything. They're non-existent. That seems to be pretty trivial to get to that conclusion.
If I could insert words into Stephen's mouth and he can correct me if I get them wrong, I don't think he's having a go at existentialism per se, although he's keeping an eye on it. But intellectualism itself is constantly claiming that it has identified what is essential, and it's almost always wrong. But it won't stop claiming that it sees what's essential. And so we're using language that is being misused by an enormous number of people. Whether we got it right or not, we're treading in dangerous territory where there's a lot.
Well, I know this other people have raised this, that which comes first, existence or essence? And I might ask, in what way? Well, obviously you have to exist, but that doesn't mean you can't have an essence. And if you didn't have that essence, you might not have existed. I might have become an oak tree rather than a human being. There is some, in Kenneth's terms, he would probably say arche that governed that organic growth. So there is an essence there in some terminology. I don't think Kenneth doesn't get hung up on terminology too much.
Well, the good news about using the word arche is it gets us out of the problem that Stephen's warning us about, because you're not going to find intellectuals all over the place claiming that they've identified the arche of something. They just won't stop talking about the essence of a thing. And the question, I think what Stephen's putting his finger on is, when they claim to have found the essence, are they just trying to excuse their own act of abstraction?
Right.
They make all kinds of errors with these generalizations.
But it also, he sometimes sounds, he's so anti-rationalist in a way that I understand, that he seems to want a philosophy that's irrational, that can't make arguments, that can't link phenomena together, that can't come to some understanding about what those phenomena might be, or do they have any other meaning that we need to recognize?
You want to be the greyhound that catches the rabbit. You know what happens to the greyhound?
I tried shooting a rabbit once, and that didn't work well. So I know I couldn't get one with a
But
hand.
here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna say it's quarter after, so we have to wrap up.
Hey,
And
great.
you guys,
Great.
as usual, have found the most interesting topic at the very last moment.
All
We'll have to do
right,
it next time.
I'll finish it off for you.
Yeah.
In Schelling's 1840 lectures, he was one of the great system builders, and he rejected the idea after Hegel. This is the thing. They all came to his 1840 lectures saying, we're finally going to receive the essence. It'll be in a bottle. And they didn't get it, and they were very upset with Schelling.
I would like to say to Sharon that her Hannah Arendt's biography is often used to attack her, to dismiss her writing, particularly her relationship with Heidegger, because of Heidegger's. Nobody understands what Heidegger wrote, but people do understand that he somehow endorsed parts of Hitler, or at least recognized that this is a big deal. Hitler is a meaningful world phenomena, and so they've now, it was not the fashion right now, but 10, 15 years ago, almost every even in popular things like The Atlantic or the New York Review of Books or whatever, there would be essays written about Hannah Arendt's, just full of it. It's total crap. She was related with Heidegger, close relationship with Heidegger, and Heidegger endorsed Hitler, and nothing needs to be said. She couldn't possibly be right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
This was not an attack, actually. This just stated the fact.
Yeah.
And in my impression, it discussed the relevance of her ideas to today. So it was not
she's been the attacks have subsided, I think.
Yes.
Okay.
Everyone's now going, oh dear, she was right. Oh no.
Yeah. Sorry, I did not read this as an attack at all.
I wish Phil were here to defend Heidegger.
Yes.
Because I don't know that Heidegger admired I don't know. But
I don't know.
That the person that any philosopher that said Hitler's not a world historical figure would have been pretty blind. That something significant in Western political science, politics, was happening in Hitler.
Which is, I think, what she explains in The Origin of Totalitarianism.
She does.
Well, for a total novice like me, her associate, and I didn't know about her marriage to Heidegger. That was just a surprise to me. And I found that fascinating. Right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to say any more.
Because we got to wrap up.
Guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
The
Very good, Rick.
life
Thank you.
and universe and everything. That's what the essentialist is looking for.
Okay.
The answer, the big answer.
I got to read this Schilling article here.
Bye, Sharon. Bye, Stephen. Bye, Donald. Bye, Joe.
It's in the chat.